Looking at the lady, the judge said that for wastefulness, for not caring for the lands, for embezzlement of taxes, she was sentenced to death. There was nothing shameful in the numerous accusations that were brought, but she did not understand where she was wasting her oval. She was furious because the judge didn't even understand what sin was. She looked at him intently, but he looked away from her. She understood that she had been sentenced unfairly. In fact, the entire aristocratic world knew that her family lived extremely modestly. Be it fashionable dress, jewelry, or silk ornaments brought from her east, she was never interested in such things. Whenever she attended balls, she only heard whispers behind her back about how she knew nothing about style. They always put civilians first. The judge looked at the girl intently and said that they would give her one last chance to repent. She understood perfectly well that all her relatives would have their heads cut off, and even if she lived, nothing would change. The young lady could not bear it any longer and burst into bitter tears. She wondered if it was worth living. She knew that even though she would die because of the emperor's unreasonable anger, he was pleased when he looked at her. She looked intently at the emperor, who did not take his gaze off her. But the young lady couldn't resist and laughed right in his face. A moment later, she looked at him with cold fury and insulted him with angry words. Sometime later, the young lady opened her beautiful eyes again. She sighed heavily, as she was a little confused, knowing that she had died earlier. A moment later, she was startled as the nanny burst into the room and called her name. The young lady looked at her nanny in surprise, as she did not expect to see. She knew that her nanny had died along with her husband due to a malfunction in the carriage. She was confused and didn't understand what was happening, so she wondered if she had gone to heaven. Madame looked at the lady with a smile and said that she seemed to be very excited because it was her birthday today. The young lady froze for a moment, not understanding what was happening. The madam told the young lady with a smile that she had prepared a lot of firewood so that she would not be cold at night. The lady asked in surprise and alarm if the butler was also here. Madam said that a long time had passed since he went on his honeymoon. The lady was surprised because she knew that years had passed since the butler had married. She was puzzled and wondered if he had married again after he went to heaven. She sighed heavily, as she assumed that he was a womanizing man after all. Madame slowly made the bed and told us everything. The young lady, in turn, could not resist the lightning speed and hugged her nanny tightly, because she missed her very much. The madam smiled and told the young lady that she had become more carefree. The madam looked intently at the young lady and asked what she had dreamed about that night. The young lady asked Madam if her brother was also here. She was a little puzzled because she didn't understand what was happening, since she firmly believed that she had gone to heaven. The madam looked at the young lady with puzzlement, as she was a little agitated by her conversation. Madam looked closely at the mistress and said that everyone was now in the empire, in the count's mansion. She looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she was still asleep. The young lady was puzzled by her words. She was surprised because she saw with her own eyes how her house burned down. With the speed of lightning, she turned around and looked intently at her room. She quickly asked the nanny how old she was turning today. The nanny smiled and said that she was turning 12 today. The young lady was in shock, wondering if she had gone back in time. With the speed of lightning, she rushed to the exit. Madame was alarmed because she did not understand the behavior of the young lady. She ran with lightning speed to her brother's small bedroom. Lariat really hoped that her brother would sleep quietly in the room. She screamed and asked him to open the door. Luhan walked out of the room and looked at his sister in surprise, as he was still sleepy. He didn't understand what had happened and asked her if she had had a nightmare. With the speed of lightning, the young lady threw herself tightly into her brother's arms. With tears in her eyes, she wished him good morning. Luhan looked at his sister with a smile and congratulated her on her birthday. The nanny looked at the inflatable lady in surprise and asked when she learned to put on a dress on her own. Lariat, in turn, smiled, and said that she was already an adult. She looked at her nanny with a smile on her face as she did everything on her own. The madam smiled and told the young lady that she was now grown up and could manage without her. Lariat rushed to the nanny with lightning speed and asked her to hug her. Madam asked the lady with a smile if she could help her with the rest of the preparations since she was wearing a dress. The madam smiled and said something to the young lady, something she had recently said herself, that she was already an adult. Lariat smiled and told her nanny that she needed to wash her face. The nanny smiled and said that she would do it since it was her birthday today. They chatted for a while, as Madame wanted to know what kind of hairstyle the young lady wanted. When she was 15, Madame returned to her hometown, and the following year she died, and unfortunately, they had little time to be together. Lariat told the nanny that she had to promise to come to her house every day. The madam smiled and told the young lady that by that time she would already be married and living somewhere else. Lariat, in turn, was focused on survival and did not want to think about marriage at all. Unfortunately, she was not knowledgeable about politics and did not know her father's position among the nobility. She didn't know what kind of relationship they had with the emperor who destroyed their family. But she understood perfectly well that now she would definitely find out the truth. She had to appear before the mad emperor. She was furious because she didn't understand what her father had already done. She understood that since things had turned out this way, she would certainly replace her own. The young lady sat quietly and pondered all the information about the emperor. She knew perfectly well that he was the worst emperor in the history of the empire. The young ladies sat quietly, sipping tea and talking about the prince. Lariat looked at her friend in surprise, as she had not heard anything about the prince. The lady smiled and said she was talking about Prince Rupert. The lady looked at everyone present with a radiant smile and said that she had seen the prince and he was very handsome. They said he was 15 years old and incredibly handsome. Lariat knew he was several years older than her. She sighed heavily, as she didn't care about him at all. The young lady said that there were terrible rumors about the young prince. Everyone looked sharply at Lariat, as they saw that she was flying in the clouds and assumed that she was not interested in their conversation. At that moment, the young lady experienced madness. So, unfortunately, she was deprived of life by their handsome prince. The young lady sighed heavily and asked the nanny how old the prince was. The nanny looked at her in bewilderment. Lariat said that Rupert Edgar Rasfi Valerium, the only son of the emperor. She looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she really meant her only daughter, the princess. Lariat looked at the nanny in surprise, as she did not expect this. She froze in shock, not understanding what was happening at all. She mentally imagined the prince in women's clothing. Madame smiled and said that the princess turned 13 this year. Madame said that, unfortunately, she had never seen her before, but there were rumors that she was incredibly beautiful. Lariat asked if the empress had really introduced a princess whom no one had ever seen. Madame sighed heavily and said that as far as she knew, it was so. Lariat believed that the emperor lived under the identity of a princess, dressing in women's clothes until he became the crown prince. Prince Arnulf decided to become crown prince, was deprived of this right, and grabbed by the throat. Rupert lived like a princess until he became a crown prince. Most likely, this was planned by his mother in order to protect her son, who was deprived of support. The madam was shocked because she did not understand why the young lady suddenly began to hit herself on the head. Lariat said with a smile that she was outraged that her head could not even remember the princess of the empire. Madame smiled and said that the count is someone who is not close to the imperial family. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it seemed like she hadn't been focusing enough on her lessons. Magdalene, later, the young lady was glowing with happiness and beauty. The madam looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was very good and beautiful. The nanny smiled and said that their lady was the most beautiful in the whole world. The madam lost her 1-year-old daughter. She cared for her as if she were her own daughter. Lariat looked at Madame intently and said that she was telling her a lie. The madam was shocked by her statement and shouted that the young lady was very cute and she should just look in the mirror. The young lady, in turn, knew perfectly well that she was not so beautiful. She looked intently into the mirror, as she felt like she was a doll. The madam smiled and said that the young lady was simply beautiful and sweet. Lariat knew very well that as she grew up she became skinny, and because of her own stubbornness she refused luxury. Unfortunately, she was an ordinary and gray mouse. She never dressed up. And yet she was a girl, and an aristocrat at that, and for that reason alone her crime was the sin of luxury. She knew that the emperor then disposed of her life at his own discretion. She understood perfectly well that even if she provided the prince with information in advance, he would not believe her, because she was just a child. She understood that now, alone, she would not be able to get rid of the cruel beast that was hiding under the mask of the emperor. She understood that even if it was annoying, she had to get closer to him, because that way she could survive. Sometime later, the young lady came down to the hall and noticed that many people had gathered for her celebration. Lariat, in turn, wanted to enjoy all the luxury in this life. She saw that all the people had gathered to gain the favor of her father, who always remained neutral. Unfortunately, she didn't understand this kind of ranch, and always blindly believed her father. She was puzzled because he was unable to protect his family and lived under constant pressure. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her father. Lariat thought for a moment, as he looked much younger than in her memories. With tears in her eyes, the young lady rushed to her father. She ran up to him with a smile and called him. The knight looked in surprise at the young lady who approached her father. He quietly called the master. The young lady, in turn, rushed into her father's arms with no speed. He looked at his daughter in surprise, as he did not expect this. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that when she leads an adult, she should first greet him politely. Lariat kissed her father tenderly and said with a smile that she missed him very much. She also asked if he was in any pain, as there were dark brown marks under his eyes. She told her father that he should live a long life. Everyone was watching them closely, as they noticed that the lady was attached to the count. She turned around as she heard someone's familiar voice. The young man smiled and asked the lady if he could greet her. She froze for a moment. A moment later, memories from her past life came flooding back. She remembered the one who had thrown her father and brother into prison, the emperor's loyal dog. The young man smiled and congratulated her on her birthday. Louis, in turn, looked at the young lady with contempt. She knew that even then everything was obvious. He looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and introduced himself, saying that his name was Louis Baden. She was furious because she knew he was a mean person, but she still thanked him with a smile on her face. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew he was a knight. She knew he was smart, and at their first meeting he didn't even have a ball. She smiled and said he looked very cool, like a knight. Louis looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was very sweet and beautiful. She smiled and said she knew it. The young lady was taken aback and looked intently at her father, as she thought he would scold her for her bad manners. But the count, in turn, only looked intently at his daughter with a radiant smile. Now she understood the power of the kiss. A moment later, she told her father that she was a little hungry. Louis looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if he could join her. The young lady, in turn, said that she did not want this. She knew that it was he who brought her to death. Lariat said that she wanted to eat only with her father and asked him to understand her correctly. The count asked his daughter if she didn't like the young man. Lariat told her father that she didn't think he was a very good person. The count was pure and sincere and never took sides and remained neutral, but unfortunately he was broken. The count looked intently at his daughter and called her. He slowly lowered her to the ground and told her that today was her birthday, so she should have fun with her friends. The count said that they could have lunch together tomorrow. She was upset, but still agreed. Some time later, the young lady came to her friends. Lariat smiled and told her friend that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Richie smiled and said that it had been a long time since their last meeting. Lariat looked closely at her innocent friend. She remembered her father, who looked at her with contempt and anger and ordered her to get out. But the young lady had no choice but to reach out to him with pleas for help. The man was furious. He pushed the lady away and shouted at her not to come near his daughter. But still, the young lady asked for help with tears in her eyes. She shouted to the Marquis that he was an old friend of her father. She begged him for salvation. With tears in her eyes and on her knees, she begged for her father to be saved. The Marquis, in turn, turned away from the young lady and said with cold fury that she was just a stupid girl. Richie looked at her friend in surprise and asked if something had happened. She told her friend that she was acting strange today. Lariat did not intend to love her friend as much in this life as in the past. She wished everyone a bon appetit with a smile. In front of her now were her old friends Richie, Marion, Sasha. She knew that they could put in a good word with the Emperor in favor of her father, and if she had been more careful, her opinion would have been taken into account. They all hated her and treated her with hostility. The young lady looked intently at the plain-looking girl who was sitting quietly in the corner. Lariat kept her gaze fixed on her, as she was seeing her for the first time. The young lady looked at the birthday girl with puzzlement. Lariat asked for forgiveness, as it was the first time she saw the young lady. She smiled and timidly asked her name. The young lady trembled and said that her name was not worth my lady's attention. She also asked the young lady not to speak so formally to her. For a moment, there was dead silence at the table. Marion asked mockingly where the foul smell came from. Marion mockingly asked how a commoner dared to sit so boldly at the same table with a noble lady on her birthday. Lariat knew that her words were very arrogant. Unfortunately, she had also been trained to be like that. The people of the county were the most saddened by the execution of their father. They were the ones who opposed it, and then they too were killed in a cruel way. She knew that all commoners were lazy and thought that they were no different from livestock. But this was not true. She looked closely at the young lady and nodded at her with a soft smile. Lariat looked at her friend and called her. Marion smiled and told the young lady that she was listening to her. Lariat, covering her nose, asked her friend if she had forgotten to take a bath today, which is why she only used perfume. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. Lariat said that it seemed like the lady smelled strongly of sweat, which is why she sprayed so much perfume. Lariat sighed heavily and said that the smell of sweat was so toxic that she really found it hard to bear. Everyone present was shocked by what was happening. Lariat, looking away from them, said that, unfortunately, she had a very weak stomach. The young lady was shocked and screamed that the smell was not coming from her. Lariat looked at the girl closely and said that this was not so, and the smell was definitely coming from the lady's side. Lariat sighed heavily and said, "This scent is terrible." The young lady was very angry and could not utter a word. She shouted at the lady with lightning speed that it was very rude. Lariat asked for forgiveness for her rudeness, but she could not bear it any longer. The young lady, in turn, left their table with lightning speed. Lariat smiled a radiant smile and said that it seemed like her nausea had passed. She looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that they could have eaten already. She smiled and said that she was very hungry. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the lady and noticed that she was about to cry. Lariat asked the lady what her name was, and with lightning speed the young lady said her name was Tori Fassbender. Lariat smiled and told the young lady that she didn't mind if she spoke less formally. She thought for a moment, as she had heard the girl's name before. She remembered that in her past life the Emperor made her empress, and on the same day killed her with his own hands. She couldn't believe that she was now with such a person, because she didn't even know her face before. On the day of the royal wedding ceremony, as they rode through the streets of the empire, she merely watched from afar. Unfortunately, she was unable to see the empress's face at that time. But now, the future empress was sitting right in front of her. She was puzzled because she understood that the emperor had married very early, and the young lady had died at a young age. She was surprised, because the girl rose from a commoner to an empress, like in a fairy tale. In a past life, the maids whispered and discussed that the emperor killed the empress because she had cheated on him. Everyone said that the late empress was Arnulf's secret lover, a spy who planned an assassination attempt on the emperor. The young lady knew they were saying very funny things, but the rumors didn't fit in her head at all. The count said that the Fassbinders now run a large trading company, but no one knew about this family before. He did not know whether the young lady had the qualities that would allow her to be called the mother of the empire. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking at her father, said that this was all everyone was talking about. She knew that even her father, who was not related to the imperial family, was against her, yet he did not interfere. The emperor then ridiculed public concern, but everyone was puzzled by his actions in the end, because he treated her like a wild animal. The count was furious, for he saw that the emperor had mocked the mother of the empire. The count said that he would make her empress, even if many were against it, because even his brother the prince was falsely accused of conspiracy and killed. He sighed heavily and said that they couldn't leave things as they were, and so they had to do something. The young lady quietly eavesdropped on their conversation, believing that her father was about to intervene. She was surprised, because she had never heard him talk about the imperial family before. Her father was considered a shield that had won the support of the people, while the aristocracy accused the emperor of madness. In this way, the emperor earned the hatred of the people of the empire. As a result, her father's mansion and lands were taken away. They were demoted in importance and isolated. Her father did not give in until the very end and stood his ground, telling the truth. Unfortunately, he paid for it with his life. Of course, she knew that the young lady was not to blame for their execution of her father and guessed that she was simply being used. But nevertheless, she still treated her with hostility. She knew that their marriage was to blame for everything. She really hoped that they would not meet in this life, but she still did not understand how the girl got to her reception. She looked closely at the young lady and called out to her, Tori startled. Lariat looked at the girl with a smile and asked how she ended up at her reception. The lady began to mumble quietly that she was the princess's maid of honor, sent by Her Majesty. Lariat wondered if the empress was the emperor's lady-in-waiting. Lariat muttered quietly that the princess had sent the young lady for her birthday. Tori jumped up with lightning speed and asked the young lady for forgiveness. She said that she had sat in a place that was not intended for her and that she would leave immediately. Lariat asked the girl to stop and eat with them. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she had not tried to drive her away at all. She was just a little surprised. Lariat, with a radiant smile, asked the young lady to have lunch with them. She knew that before the death of Valois, the empress had no connections with the imperial family. Unfortunately, she didn't know that Rupert had sent a maid of honor for her birthday. She had never met Rupert in his role as a princess before. She only saw him when he became a prince. The first imperial ball to which she was invited at the age of 16. Richie asked her friend with a smile if she had seen the crown prince. She said with admiration that he was incredibly handsome, and his face was simply dazzling. Lariat asked in surprise if this was true, and Richie said with a radiant smile that of course it was true. A moment later, the young lady froze in place in surprise as she saw a handsome prince. She was momentarily stunned as she saw that he was glowing with beauty. A moment later, their eyes met. Unfortunately, she couldn't take her embarrassed gaze off him. A few minutes later, the prince approached her and greeted her. He introduced himself and said that he was very pleased to meet her. Lariat smiled and introduced herself, saying that she was very glad to meet him. In turn, The prince slowly took her hand and kissed it tenderly. He looked at her with a smile and congratulated her on her debut. She looked at him in surprise, as she was embarrassed because he pretended not to know who she was. Now she wondered if he had really known who she really was. She was furious because he knew about her existence and only pretended not to know her. Tori looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was sure it would be okay if she stayed. Tori told the lady that her expression didn't suggest it. Lariat said with a smile that everything was fine. She just didn't know how best to take care of the princess's maid of honor on her birthday. Lariat asked the lady if she could tell the princess that she was happy. The lady smiled and said that she would tell the princess. Lariat asked the lady when she started serving the princess. Tori said that she arrived in service about a week ago. Richie looked at her friend closely and said that she was acting a little strange today. Lariat was taken aback and said that this was not so, and also began to eat dessert. She stared at the small piece of cake, as she had loved desserts when she was a child, but now she couldn't stand them. Richie looked at her friend with concern and said that she seemed to be sick. Richie was puzzled by her friend's behavior, since she didn't even touch her favorite food. Lariat smiled and said that she simply had no appetite. Richie was puzzled. She told her friend that it was a lie, because even when she was sick, she still ate a plate of pudding. Lariat smiled and said that she seemed to have a slight fever. Richie looked at the butler with concern and said that the young lady currently had a fever. The butler, with the speed of lightning, moved to the lady and asked if she was in pain. Lariat sighed heavily and said that she was only in a little pain. The butler was taken aback by shock, as she didn't even eat the cake. With the speed of lightning, he grabbed her in his arms and shouted that she was really very ill. He shouted that they would slowly call a doctor. She was shocked because she did not understand why a doctor was needed. The butler excitedly shouted that the young lady had not even eaten dessert, and he would immediately speak to the count and bring the best doctor. She was in shock, since she was not ill. The butler, with tears in his eyes, told the young lady that he was very concerned about her illness. The butler, with lightning speed, asked the young gentleman where the count was now. The young man looked at the butler in surprise and asked why he needed him. The butler shouted that my lady was unwell. The butler said that she didn't even eat her favorite cake. She just looked at the dessert with a fork in her hand. The butler said with tears in his eyes that the young lady had only been scolded yesterday because she had eaten with her hands. Luhan looked at his sister sadly and asked if she was really sick. She sighed heavily, as she realized that she now looked more like a pig. The butler looked at the gentleman and said that the young lady felt sick at the sight of the cake. The count shouted that they needed to call a doctor immediately. After examination, the doctor said that the young lady had no abnormalities. The count sighed heavily and said that the doctor had done a good job. She knew this was true, because he had sat over her for several hours. The count looked at his daughter with a tender smile. But a moment later, he changed his expression and called out to the knight. The knight flew into my room with the speed of lightning and asked the master if he had called him. The count sighed heavily and told the knight that he must bring the most famous doctor, because they must not find the reason for her changes. The young lady, with her lightning speed, called out to her father. She sighed heavily, because she knew that she had really led herself astray, very stupidly. The count looked at his daughter with tears in his eyes and asked her to wait a little. He said he would definitely take her to a competent doctor, not a quack. Luhan said they could talk to Mom and find a new doctor. She looked closely at her family and said that she had been examined by a very good doctor. She sighed heavily as she saw that they were completely ignoring her words. The count said that her mother's problem was that she treated people too well, and she gave shelter to a magic charlatan. Lariat looked closely at her father and said with a soft smile that she really wasn't sick. The count was furious. He shouted that charlatans surrounded him. He understood that she was definitely ill. She sighed heavily and mentally asked her doctor for forgiveness, because she was now a charlatan. Luhan looked closely at his sister and told her that she should lie down and rest. The young lady looked closely at her brother, as he was acting very funny. A moment later, she couldn't bear it any longer and suddenly shouted that she wasn't sick at all. She sighed heavily as she realized she should have just eaten the cake. She was puzzled. If she had known that they would make such a noise, she would not have left a crumb on her plate. She told her father that he called the doctor, and it was a waste of money. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really thought the problem was money. She understood perfectly well that if her mother found out about everything, she would go crazy, because as a child she had suffered from a terrible illness and was on the verge of death. Then the madam burst into bitter words and asked her daughter for forgiveness. Then her mother was by her side, day and night. Bursting into tears, the madam prayed for the salvation of her child. Lariat looked at her father intently and asked him not to tell her mother about this situation. The count looked closely at his daughter and said that he would not notify Amanda for now. The young lady felt relieved by his words. She sighed heavily as thoughts of death visited her. On a hot summer day when she was 18 years old, she unfortunately went to the chopping block and died in silence. Unfortunately, circumstances overwhelmed her, and she woke up with tears in her eyes. She knew that her corpse lay in the ground, and the emperor mocked her from afar. The young man looked at his sister excitedly and called her. He looked at her intently and told her not to worry. She sighed heavily and closed her eyes back. He said that he didn't think she had a serious illness at all. She smiled and asked if he hadn't been the one who had previously assured her that she was incredibly ill. Luhan said that they brought a doctor from the capital, and he would come to her soon, and she would get better. The young lady looked at her family with tears in her eyes. They saw her tears and were taken aback. In a hurry, they shouted to the doctor to hurry up. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the doctor and asked for forgiveness. Sometime later, she lay quietly in her bed, pretending to be asleep. Lariat Pri opened one eye, because she wanted to check if everyone had left. But a moment later, she froze in place as she saw her brother in front of her. The young lady touched her brother tenderly and said that she very much hoped that he would not avoid her in the future. He smiled, holding her hand, and said that he would never avoid her. She sighed heavily, as she knew that this was not the case, and most likely it was she who was avoiding him. Lariat was well aware that it was all due to adolescence. She knew that a long time had passed since he had taken care of her. He looked at her intently and said that she had said earlier that she would love him no matter what kind of person he was. She looked at him in surprise and said that everything was exactly like that. He smiled and said that he would also love her, no matter what kind of person she would be. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. A moment later, she sat up and looked after him in surprise. Memories came flooding back to her. Looking at her younger brother, she remembered him in his past life. He also told her that she shouldn't get sick. She looked at her brother with a smile, because she understood that he was still the same. The next day, the young lady looked around her room closely. She knew that her room was very nice, because her grandfather personally designed it for her grandmother. It was a dear and special place for her. Her brother was born in early spring, a significant day for the whole family. In the summer, they often went to the capital. And autumn was her mother's favorite time. Winter was especially beautiful on the estate. She knew that this applied to all seasons as well. She looked closely at the very wall where they had marked their growth. The last time they noted growth, she was sick. Lariat was taken aback for a moment and wondered if her head had only grown since she was 12 years old, right up until her death. She was puzzled because, unfortunately, she stopped growing when she was 14 years old, and, unfortunately, there was nothing she could do about it. Her brother constantly made fun of her. She knew she should exercise and eat more. She looked around the room with a smile, as it was different from what she remembered last time. A moment later, she found her music box. Her brother had given it to her. She knew that her brother must have stolen the precious box for her. But then memories of her brother lying in the grave with the box came flooding back. She knew that her house had been deliberately set on fire to destroy all the evidence. And all she had left was a music box, which she barely managed to save. She saw the lifeless body of her brother, who died a little before her. She was shocked because she lost everything in an instant. Her brother was executed first, just because he was a man. Lariat screamed furiously at the Emperor to kill her first, but unfortunately, the anonymous woman could do nothing. With her eyes full of tears and with rage, she screamed that she wanted to die before her brother. In anger, she asked the Emperor if he could not hear her well. Bursting into tears, she moved from threats to requests. After all, she simply could not bear the death of her brother. She begged the Emperor to kill her. Now she realized that she was unhappy and helpless. Unfortunately, she had no one left, so she shed bitter tears alone. Then she sat at her brother's grave and screamed from hopelessness. The young lady trembled when she remembered her past life, but now she knew that they would allow such a sad end. A moment later, she found her treasured diary. She knew that if anyone found it, they would simply think it was her childhood fantasy. She knew that the young lady should not become empress, otherwise it would be the beginning of a conflict between her father and the Emperor. She was puzzled because she knew there had to be some way out, because she didn't want to lose her beloved family again. A moment later, she began to write down all the dates and what was connected with them. She recorded when the Emperor ascended the throne, all the executions after he became Emperor. She was on a mission. She knew that many people had died in those days. It was even difficult for her to remember everyone. Typical of the reign of a tyrant, he simply created a one-sided massacre in the empire. He was a madman who killed his family like a beast. He killed his own uncle and cousin. The empire was based on the nobility, and their influence was great, but in the end, the confrontation was recognized as treason to the crown. Thus, all power was in the hands of the Emperor. Only Nigel, who was of mixed blood, managed to escape. The ladies suggest that this was the Emperor's only favor. She had no idea why he had become so crazy. Even if she had gone back in time, she could hardly have done anything about his true nature. She knew she was back to life, and it was a miracle, but she didn't want to die trying to change the Emperor. She knew that she needed to establish the best possible relationship with the Emperor. She wanted to reconcile her father and the Emperor, and to do this, she needed to become the princess's maid of honor. She voiced her little news to her parents, but they were categorically against it. The young lady was shocked, because she did not expect to hear such a thing. The madam was furious and burning with anger, as she did not want to send her daughter to his imperial palace. Amanda was furious and didn't understand why her daughter decided to go there. She didn't want to listen to anything. The young lady sighed heavily and told her mother that she didn't even want to listen to her. Amanda screamed at her daughter that she couldn't fly into the palace like the wind. She said Richie is Princess Nigel's maid of honor, and her remaining friends would also like to be maids of honor. Madame sighed heavily and said that she didn't like Richie from the very beginning. Lariat said that she didn't ask her to go to the princess. The madam looked sadly at her daughter and asked if she didn't like it at home. Amanda shouted to her daughter that she didn't know this world yet. The imperial palace may look magnificent and elegant, but it is very dangerous. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew that what his mother said was the pure truth. The madam sighed heavily and said that she could no longer continue the conversation like this, and asked her son to bring a whip. The young man sighed heavily and drooped from his mother's words. Lariat looked intently at her brother, as she knew that he had always been obedient. The count looked intently at his wife and said that their daughter was stubborn, but she did not need to be beaten for it. But Madame thought that she needed to be scolded. Lariat looked at her mother intently and asked her to calm down. She understood perfectly well that she had to somehow persuade her parents, but unfortunately, she didn't know what she needed to do. She knew that, as the youngest daughter of the family at her current age, it would be easy to become a maid of the imperial family. She knew she couldn't hesitate, so she said that Lefort was far from the power struggle, so it was less dangerous than serving Arnulf. Looking at her mother, she said that she could study culture and etiquette, because the royal family had no equal in this. She said that there were a lot of aristocrats in the palace, and her peers would be there, because she would soon have to get married, so she could start looking for a groom. The count was surprised that his daughter was talking about marriage. She said that when she grew up, she would become less popular and there would be no demand for her. Lariat, she said that there is Richie in the imperial palace, and her aunt lives in the capital, so they will lend her a helping hand. The young lady was confident that after her words, her mother would agree. But the madam firmly refused her daughter. The young lady knew that she had an ace up her sleeve, and with tears in her eyes, she looked at her mother. Bursting into tears, the young lady asked if she was even capable of this. Madame told her daughter that she would never enter the imperial palace, and therefore she should abandon this idea. The young lady, with tears in her eyes, said that she would refuse and would not go along with it, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. But the next day, the young lady ran away from home and left a note for her parents. She rushed to the coachman in a hurry, carrying a heavy suitcase with her. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was an adult. She sighed heavily and said that he should go ahead. The man wondered for a moment whether nobles traveled to the capital in the same carriage. She asked irritably what he was doing, since they had to go. He agreed with her, but noticed that she was acting a bit strange. She knew everything had gone well, and hoped that her father would not discover the loss before she needed to. She knew she was very sorry she had done what she had done, and she understood that when they woke up, they would be shocked. The young lady looked out the window at her home. She knew it would be nice to have a maid who could prepare the carriage. She was puzzled because her current memories were very vague and imprecise. At that time, she didn't understand what was good or bad, and she also couldn't do anything on her own. She knew that if she really became a maid of honor, she would not have the opportunity to return home. The young lady said goodbye to her home with a tender smile, for she was leaving to protect it. She was happy because she knew that her home and all its inhabitants would certainly be taken care of. Sometime later, the young lady arrived at the place. She looked closely at her aunt's estate, as she noticed that it looked luxurious. Her Aunt Amelia was vain and ambitious. She became the 5th mistress of the Duke, who had his eye on the imperial throne. She didn't care that her father was against it, and she didn't care what people thought either. But in the end, she and the Duke were killed by the Emperor. The lady knew that her aunt believed in fairy tales, as befitted a noblewoman, but she also knew that her aunt was not a bad person. She rang the bell, but there was silence in response. She wondered if there was anyone in the estate. The young lady was worried because she didn't know what to do now, and she needed to find a place to stay. She was grateful to the coachman, so she gave almost all her savings. She wondered if she should go to her friend, but unfortunately, she did not know where she was. She knew that her friend lived in the capital because she traveled to work and back home, but unfortunately, the young lady was not sure whether her friend was still living in the same place. She was puzzled and didn't know what to do in this situation. Lariat sighed heavily, as she knew that she had not eaten anything since morning. She knew that she needed to eat and then think about what to do next. Lariat sighed heavily, as she realized that moving on foot was very difficult. Now she understood perfectly well that it was all because she had previously only moved with the help of a carriage. She noticed that she was already very close, but she was puzzled because she did not know where she could eat. A moment later, she saw a community member shouting that he had only one portion of dumplings left. He shouted and asked who wanted to buy it. The man shouted that he would give her away for half the price. The young lady looked intently at the man in turn. And a moment later, she shouted that she would buy a portion of dumplings. She shouted with a smile that he should sell her dumplings. The man laughed. She slowly placed the coin on the table, as she was glad that she would finally have something to eat for the day. After all, she had worked so hard for it. But a moment later, she froze in shock as someone stole her portion of dumplings. She turned around and a moment later saw the thief, asking for forgiveness. She grabbed the girl by the hand. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she should give her breakfast. The young lady was furious as she took the first portion of dumplings. Lariat flinched when she saw the young girl's intense gaze. She looked closely at the girl and realized that he had grabbed her wrist quite hard, but she saw absolutely no reaction. With the speed of lightning, she let go of the young girl. She looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness while stroking her head. The young girl cringed and growled in response. Lariat was surprised and at the same time puzzled because she did not understand what was happening. She wondered why the girlfriend suddenly started to get angry. Lariat was puzzled and didn't understand why she was retreating, because the only one who should be angry in this situation was her. A moment later, with the speed of lightning, she grabbed the girl by the hand. The girl, in turn, growled and told the lady to let her go immediately. Lariat yelled at the young girl to take her hands off her dumplings. Lariat looked closely at the young girl as she realized that she had neither money nor an escort, but she spoke skillfully, like a true aristocrat. Lariat looked at the man intently and said that she was the first to pay for the portion of dumplings, and the girl did not pay, so the dumplings should go to her. Lariat looked at the girl intently and said that before she could eat anything, she had to pay for it. She asked if the girl really thought that everything here belonged to her. The girl looked at her in surprise and asked if they had found out from her. She fell from the oak tree. Lariat sighed as she realized that the young girl knew nothing about the world. She was surprised as the young lady didn't even know that she had to pay. Lariat was a little puzzled because she did not understand why they behaved so stupidly in the courtyard when their families were falling apart. She looked closely at her companion and asked which of them had fallen from the oak tree. Lariat asked the girl if she was lost. Lariat noticed that her clothes were of terrible quality and that she had no escort. She thought that the girl looked even younger than her brother. She thought that the girl was the daughter of some landless nobleman. Lariat sighed heavily, as she now knew many noble families. She wanted to help the young girl find a home. She said that she would help her find a home right after she ate her dumplings. Lariat looked at the girl with a smile and said that she didn't need to worry about such things. The girl looked at her with bewilderment and asked if she really wanted to die. Lariat, in turn, ran away from home precisely because she did not want to die at all. Lariat looked closely at the young girl and asked if she would really kill her. After this question, the girl began to grind her teeth. Lariat noticed that the young lady continued to behave like a child. Lariat smiled and told the young lady that if she continued to grimace like that, she would definitely get wrinkles someday. The man looked at them intently and said with a smile that they did not need to quarrel, and he would simply prepare another portion for them. The young lady, in turn, was very happy about this. She ran up to the man with a joyful smile. But a moment later, the young girl grabbed her suddenly. Lariat with cold fury. The young lady looked at her with bewilderment, as she did not understand why she behaved in such a way. The girl looked at the lady with fury and told her to stop interrupting her. Lariat froze in surprise, as she realized that children these days clearly had behavioral problems. She understood that they would have no future if the prince became emperor. Lariat sighed but said nothing. The girl approached the young lady closer and asked her name. Lariat froze in place in shock, as she did not expect this. The girl looked at her intently and told her to answer right now. Lariat smiled softly and, taking her hand back, said that she would not think of answering her. A moment later, she smiled and said that her dumplings were ready. The girl looked at the young lady with fury. Lariat walked away with a defeated smile, as she knew that children should not be so rude. Some time later, the young lady ran up to her friend and screamed. Lariat smiled and told her friend that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The young lady, in turn, was very scared, as she didn't expect to see her friend. Richie, breathing heavily, said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Lariat asked her friend with a smile if she was really surprised. Richie sighed heavily and asked her friend how she got here. The young lady smiled and said that she would have to explain for a long time. Richie was shocked and told her friend to try to explain everything to her. Richie was surprised. She did not understand why her friend was dressed so lightly in such cold weather. Lariat smiled and said that, unfortunately, she did not have time to think about clothes. She briefly said that she had come to become a maid of honor at the palace. Richie was shocked. She asked her friend if the Count had really given his consent. She understood perfectly well that this simply could not have happened, and if it had all been true, she would not have looked like this. The young lady looked at her friend in bewilderment and asked what was wrong with her. Richie was shocked and shouted at her friend that she looked like a beggar. Richie sighed heavily and said that she was shocked by the fact that suddenly some beggar ran up to her and shouted her name. Lariat smiled and asked if beggars wore dresses like that. Richie said that it was already worn out and should be thrown away. Lariat sighed heavily and said that it seemed the Marquise was suffering from extravagance. Richie looked closely at her friend and asked why she was there, since it was very dangerous to walk alone. Lariat smiled and told her friend that she was also alone. Richie was shocked. She shouted that she had several guards accompanying her, and even on their lands her father did not walk alone, because it was very dangerous. Lariat knew that the young lady had been like an older sister to her before, but now she looked very cute. Lariat looked at her friend with a smile and said that she was here to see her. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that it was time for them to return. A moment later they entered the estate. Lariat looked closely at her friend, as she turned out to be very mature. Richie looked closely at the young lady and said that she thought she had changed a little. Lariat was a little puzzled, because she knew that this complicated the matter. She was shocked. Her friend immediately suspected everything. She knew she had to pretend she didn't know anything. Richie looked at her closely and said that it was also about her birthday, because surprisingly she acted in a very peculiar way with the young lady. But Richie said that she liked it, because she did not like the young lady. Richie looked closely at her friend and asked if she usually acted independent and indifferent. Lariat shuddered and tensed up. Richie said that today she acted differently again, because she had come a long way. The young lady looked at her friend closely and said that it was not so, and she had come prepared in advance, for she had thought of this when her friend said that she was going to be a maid of honor. Richie looked at her in surprise and asked if she really separated her family's opinion from her own. She was surprised that her friend did something that her father did not agree with. She said that her family is famous for keeping everyone away from the imperial family and public scandals. Lariat was a little puzzled because her friend suspected something was wrong. She knew that her friend was still a child and she would be able to deceive her. Lariat sighed heavily and said that it must be all because of puberty. She said that her heart ached and she missed spring from time to time. Just from looking at the sight of the withered flowers, she felt depressed. Richie looked at her friend intently, but did not answer. Lariat sighed heavily and said that her family was suffocating her. Richie froze in shock, as she had not expected anything like this. Lariat was puzzled, as she knew what their future would be like. She wondered if this was really the meaning of life. In her past life, Richie was angry with her family because they wanted her to marry a man from a noble family, without taking her opinion into account. They wanted her to give birth to a child in order to continue the family line. Lariat said with tears in her eyes that they told her it was out of resentment, and she only complained, but she soon envied the free worker or merchant. Richie was shocked because she realized that her friend thought the same way as she did. Richie looked closely at her friend and asked her supportively if she really felt as if their status was a shackle for them. Lariat, in turn, believed that this was not the case at all, but she had to play along with her friend. She didn't have a transitional period. Her behavior was always calm. She always behaved as she presented to her family, because it was the order of things, but her friend had such a period. Richie was furious. She didn't understand why. Being the eldest daughter of the family, she should live only for her family. She screamed that her father had ordered her to become a maid of honor, and she tried to somehow avoid it, but it was all in vain. Bursting into tears, she screamed that it was only a matter of political interest, and she was forced to accept the engagement to the Baron. They forced her to do this, even knowing that she already had a lover. She was furious and didn't understand why she had to live like this. Lariat hugged her friend tightly, trying to somehow comfort her. Richie looked closely at her friend and asked if that was why she ran away from her family. She asked her friend if she hadn't even told the Count about it. Lariat sighed heavily and said that she had written them a letter and had also brought her identification card and a medallion with a coat of arms. A moment later, the young lady couldn't help but laugh hysterically. Lariat looked at her friend in surprise, as she didn't understand why she was laughing. Richie looked at her friend with a smile and said that she was the best, and she didn't even know she had that side of her. Richie smiled and extended a helping hand to her friend, saying that she would keep it a secret from the Count. But unfortunately, the young lady could not get close to the palace, otherwise she would have been kicked out. Richie looked closely at her friend and asked who would believe that she was Lariat Valois. Lariat was shocked by her friend's statement. She shouted that she was not that black and that she had only not washed for 1 day. Moments later, the young lady said of her maid that the vow had washed her friend, for she really did smell. Sometime later, the young lady was quietly taking a bath. She sighed often, as she was glad that she had finally arrived in the capital. She understood that since the prince would now be nearby, she could breathe freely. Sometime later, the young lady, in full dress, sat quietly sipping tea. The madam looked closely at the young lady, as she was surprised by her skill, because the girl had a perfect gait and impeccable manners. The young lady screamed with joy as she had achieved so much in her short time at the shelter. For a moment, memories of her past life came flooding back to her, because after studying with 1 miss, she almost died, because it was very difficult for her. The madam looked at the lady intently and said that she was so young, but she already had excellent manners. Madam looked at the young lady intently and said that she was increasing the number of their classes today. Richie was shocked by the statement, "Madam." Richie looked closely at her friend and said that she had not been like this in her classes before. She asked her friend if she had been practicing at night instead of sleeping. Richie sighed heavily and told her friend that it turned out she was a very hard worker. Richie smiled and said that now she could understand why her friend ran away from home. Lariat looked at her friend and said that the outfit was too small for her. She looked at her friend closely and said that she looked like a child. Richie smiled and told her friend that she looked very good. Lariat was puzzled because her friend gave her clothes that were too small for her. Richie told her friend with a smile that she was cute, like a chubby child. Sometime later they got into the carriage, preparing to leave. Richie said that the young lady should not be tactless and rush. She also informed her that in her carriage, Prow instead of a horse. Lariat looked at her friend in surprise and asked if they were really going to jump. U-carriage. Richie smiled and said that they were small and they were set on fire and used for power, because the emperor brought them from abroad and bred them here, so it became so fashionable that the capital is now overflowing with frogs. Richie sighed heavily and told her friend that this is why she would not be accepted as a maid of honor. Lariat knew that her brother's Russian family was very kind to her family, so she would be able to become a maid of honor. A moment later, she arrived at the imperial palace for an interview. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if something was bothering her. Lariat said that was not the case, and as he could tell from her health certificate, she was very healthy. He looked at her closely and sighed heavily and said that she was still a child. He said that it looked like she had had the plague, and therefore she should have a stronger immunity. He asked if she had ever taken poison. The young lady answered in the negative. He sighed heavily and said that in that case she could not work in the kitchen. The man asked what her name was, but she would like to be. The young lady said that she would like to work as a maid. He sighed heavily and said that he could not allow the daughter of a great family to do such work. He said that her identity had been confirmed, and he had also received a letter of recommendation. He said that although she was a qualified child, the princess already had enough young maids. The young lady said that she did not apply for the position of Princess Nigel's maid. The man said that the prince did not employ young maids. The young lady, in turn, said that she would like to be a maid of honor to Princess Laferte. The man froze in surprise and asked if she really wanted to be the princess's maid of honor. A moment later he said that this was very good news, and then she would not need to be checked. He said that he would now show her the surroundings. The lady was surprised by such a change. Lariat knew that the princess was still a member of the royal family, but they were so casual about choosing a maid that it scared her. But in turn, she knew that it was only for the best for her. She had a joyful smile and walked to meet the princess. But after a long walk, she sighed heavily, as she realized that the palace was very far away. The man looked at her intently and, wiping his sweat with a smile, said that the hat suited her very well. He smiled a gentle smile and said that she looked like a child. The young lady was shocked by such a statement. A moment later, she froze in place when she saw that they had arrived at the palace. She was surprised because it was deserted. The man said that usually the others arrived later. He looked at her closely and said that there were things that would be difficult for her to do, so they would deal with them by noon, and then they would leave. Later, only a few maids would remain. The young lady sighed heavily and looked at the young man with a smile, as she saw that he had a terrible temper. A moment later, she froze in place because she knew that behind the door was the princess's bedroom. She was very scared because she knew that he had killed her in her past life, but now she wanted to pull herself together because she knew that her family was alive and he had not killed her yet. Memories came flooding back, but she still knew that her family was alive and she could change everything. A moment later, the young man entered the room and informed the princess that it was he, and also said that he had come to the princess with a new maid of honor. The young lady froze for a moment when she saw the princess. She froze in place as she realized that he had finally achieved his goal. She realized that in life the princess was even more beautiful. Lariat was dumbfounded on the spot because she understood that now in front of her was not a girl at all. She saw before her the most cruel emperor in the history of the empire. Lariat knew that he was not a man at all, but a monster. The man smiled and said that the young lady had expressed a desire to take care of the princess. The young lady bowed low and said that she was very honored to meet her princess. The princess looked intently at those present and asked what her name was. The man froze in place for a moment in surprise. Lariat sighed heavily and, trembling with fear, said that her name was Lariat Isabelle de Valois. The man looked at the princess intently and said that the young lady was the eldest daughter of the count. The princess looked at the young man with cold fury and said that she had not asked him. The man shielded the young lady with his body and told the princess that if she did not like her, she should still accept the servant. The princess looked angrily at the young man and told him to leave immediately. The man said that the young lady was a representative of the South. The princess pounced on the young lady with lightning speed. Looking into his eyes, she quietly whispered that this simply could not be. The princess was shocked and shouted that the young lady was eating too many dumplings and that it would cost her a fortune to keep the young lady. The young lady was shocked, as she now realized that the child she had met at the market was the emperor himself. The man looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The princess pointed her finger at the young lady and said that she was a dumpling thief. The young lady bowed and told the princess that she was allergic to dumplings. The princess froze in shock, as she did not expect it to be pinned. The young lady said she couldn't even stand the smell of them ever since she tried them when she was little. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked if she was allergic to dumplings. Lariat smiled tenderly and said that it was exactly like that. The princess looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she had been mistaken in her judgment. The young lady said that it seemed so, since her appearance was quite ordinary, and she could easily confuse her. A moment later, the princess told her assistant to leave quickly. In turn, the young princess, with her lightning speed, fell onto the bed. She sighed heavily and asked the young lady if she was from the South. The princess looked closely at the lady and asked if she was really the daughter of the count, an honorary representative of the nobility. Lariat sighed heavily and said that it was exactly so. The princess was puzzled because she did not know if the young lady was really that Valois. The princess sighed heavily and asked why someone like her would steal dumplings. The young lady looked at the princess with puzzlement, as she had also stolen dumplings before. Lariat looked at the princess with big eyes and said that she did not understand what she was talking about. The princess sighed heavily and asked if the count had given her permission to come to the imperial palace. The young lady said that this was not the case, and she decided to come to the palace of her own free will. The princess asked the lady in surprise if she had come to the imperial palace to see her of her own free will. She was surprised and did not understand why the young lady had done this. Lariat smiled and said that she had heard a lot about the young princess from her father. She smiled and said that for this reason she wanted to serve the princess when she grew up. The princess, with the speed of lightning, rose up and asked hastily if the count was talking about her. The princess looked intently at the young lady, waiting for an answer. Lariat looked at the prince with bewilderment, as she saw that he looked like a small, defenseless child. The young lady sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly as it was, and that her father had said that the princess was very beautiful and wise beyond her years. She smiled and said that her father praised the princess for her great qualities and said that she could become a great king if she were a prince. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew that this was a pure lie. The princess, in turn, looked at the young lady with bewilderment. A moment later, she sat down on the bed and said that she did not remember ever meeting the count. The young lady smiled and said that if the princess did not know her father, it did not mean that her father did not know about her. The princess smiled and said that she knew her father, but she did not suspect that he was crazy. The young lady smiled, because she knew that the prince was actually right. She looked at him intently, because she knew that with his small hands, he killed her entire family and her. Lariat wanted to rush at the prince and strangle him with her own hands. She wanted to kill him here and now, and thus avenge her family. A moment later, the princess screamed, and the young lady shuddered, as she was deeply immersed in her thoughts. She was puzzled, as she did not understand why such thoughts had come to her, because she knew that killing a member of the imperial family was treason, and her family could suffer again. The princess sighed heavily, and told the young lady that she had heard earlier that she had helped her maid of honor. The princess told the young lady that in that case she could work here. She looked at the princess in bewilderment and asked what she meant. The princess glanced sideways at the young lady and said that this would be payment for the dumplings. She said that only then would she let her go. The young lady was furious and did not understand why the princess was staring at her, as she had no intention of forgiving her for stealing the dumplings. The young lady bowed and told the princess that she did not know what the princess was talking about, but she still decided to thank her for the opportunity. The princess, in turn, looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she would not stay in the palace for long. The princess looked into the distance with a smirk and told the young lady that she would boycott her. The young lady, in turn, looked at the princess with a smirk on her face, but did not answer. A moment later, she entered the room where she was supposed to reside. She sighed heavily, as she was very tired. She remembered the young man who had said with a smile that she would no longer need to train if she decided to serve the princess. The young lady, in turn, looked around the room closely. She knew that she had now become the official maid of honor to the princess, and that she had been given a whole, spacious room, and that now her father could do nothing more. With lightning speed, the young lady threw open the closet doors, but she, in turn, was immersed in her thoughts, as she knew that she now had access to the palace that only high-class servants could obtain. She understood perfectly well that she could start work without a probationary period. A moment later, she heard a knock at the door and gave permission for the person to enter. She turned around and saw a young lady. Tori entered and greeted the young lady timidly. Lariat looked closely at her new friend and said with a smile that she could call her by her first name. She smiled and said that they could sit down and talk first. Lariat looked closely at the young lady, as she could see that she was very nervous. Lariat, in turn, wondered what kind of relationship she had with the prince. She knew the girl had mentioned earlier that she had served the prince for less than a week, but it was entirely possible that there was a significant difference between what she told her and what she actually meant. After all, she knew that for a maid of honor who had been in the palace for less than a week, the prince would not turn a blind eye to mistakes. She understood perfectly well that there was nothing shameful in taking advantage of the service of a young friend. She looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she had brought a maid of honor uniform for her. Tori smiled and said that it was all true, since none of those who had served Her Royal Highness before had a high social status. Tori said with a beaming smile that she was very glad that the young lady was here now. Lariat bowed and smiled as she thanked the young lady for bringing her the uniform. Tori was taken aback and told the young lady that she didn't need to thank her like that. Lariat understood perfectly well that the girl felt pressured due to the difference in status. She knew very well how the nobles looked in the eyes of merchants, workers, and local residents. Most were dissatisfied with providing for the nobles, and the rest were filled with envy. From birth, honorable nobles are able to find blessings by simply being polite. People wanted very much to win their favor. The kindness of one who initially has no need to be magnanimous will be regarded by him as absolute vanity. Lariat was well aware that the young lady would be of great use. She knew that it would not be difficult for her to win the young lady's trust. She knew there was no point in discussing the suitability of this careless system. Unfortunately, the world has been unfair to all people. Even she, the famous daughter of a count, a representative of one of the noblest families in the most populous empire, died an unhappy death at the whim of the emperor. Unfortunately, she could find no other way to save her life than to gain his mercy. She understood perfectly well that this was how it should be. Gathering her courage, she watched as the young lady, unsuspectingly, became an empress. She knew perfectly well that she would not like it, but she had to use the young lady for her needs. Lariat raised that it was all because the result was much more important than the methods of achieving it. If she managed to prevent the fall of her own family, then she would easily close her eyes to the tragedy of the empress, the face, which she did not even know. Tori looked at the young lady with a radiant smile and said that she should wear it from tomorrow, as the princess wanted to see her right now. A moment later, the young lady, having collected herself, came to the princess and asked if she had called her. But unfortunately, there was only pitch silence in response. Tori smiled at the young lady and said that she could come in. Lariat looked closely at the young prince. She knew that he was a member of the imperial family, but he had no dignity at all. A moment later, the young lady bowed low to the princess. The princess sighed heavily and called her maid of honor. Lariat looked at the prince in surprise, as she did not understand why he was looking at her intently. She wondered if he really wanted her to come to him. The young lady was furious, as she knew perfectly well that he could have simply told her what he wanted, but a moment later she nevertheless approached the princess and bowed low. The young princess looked away from them and told the young lady that she would now be checking her food. Lariat was furious as she knew that the prince wanted her to check his food for poison. She wondered if he wanted to experiment on her. She looked at the prince with cold fury, but still smiled back. Tori looked at the princess with worry and asked what she wanted to do with my lady who had become a noble maid of honor. The princess told her maid of honor to be quiet since they were equals. The young lady, in turn, looked at the prince with fury. She did not understand how the lady could serve him. But a moment later, she looked closely at the princess and agreed with her. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she had just said. The princess looked at the lady with bewilderment and asked if the daughter of a count's family had no pride. The young lady sighed heavily and asked what the need for pride was when helping Her Most Noble Highness. The princess looked at the young lady intently and said that she had indeed heard nothing from her father. The young lady said with a smile that her father admired the princess's beauty and intelligence. The princess looked at the young lady in bewilderment and said that the Agraf could not have said such a thing in vain. The princess pushed the young lady away and slapped her in the face, and also said that since she had come to Princess Nigel, she should not attract attention and should leave quickly. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, but said nothing. She did not understand why he was so confident in his words. She did not understand why he said that he had never met her father. Lariat knew that she first needed to lower the boy's guard. She looked at the princess intently and said that neither her father nor Her Highness the Princess had anything to do with her support for Princess Lafair. The young lady bowed low and said that she would do everything in her power. A moment later, she heard her dress bursting at the seams. She sat up and saw that the buttons from her dress were flying towards the princess, the young lady of opium, and rushed towards the princess. A moment later, the princess froze in place in shock as buttons struck her on the forehead. Lariat was shocked by everything that was happening, as she did not expect such a thing. The princess sighed heavily and told the young lady that she was doing everything in her power in a strange way. Lariat sighed heavily and, puzzled, told the princess that she hadn't wanted anything like that, but the princess didn't listen to her and left the room with lightning speed. The young lady took her turn, looked around and froze in place, because she thought that there were too many weapons in the room. She was puzzled. She understood that the prince was going to do the same to his own, but she still did not understand where he managed to get so many weapons. A moment later, she sat down and began to collect the buttons. She sighed heavily and thanked her new friend. Tori looked at the young lady with embarrassment and said that she didn't need to thank her. Tori said that everything happened because the princess doubted the young lady's identity. She said that she told the princess that she was the daughter of an earl, so she didn't need to worry. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and asked if it was okay that the princess went out alone. Tori smiled and said that everything would be fine because Lord Baden would be there to escort the young princess. Lariat shuddered as she realized that the lord was the emperor's devoted dog. The young lady smiled and said that the princess was sometimes rude to strangers, so she shouldn't pay attention to it. Lariat sighed heavily and said with a smile that this did not mean that she did not know what kind of person she was. Lariat looked closely at the young lady and said that her eyes and hair color were the same as the princess's. Tori sighed heavily and said embarrassedly that it just happened that way. Lariat was puzzled and did not understand how the young lady became similar to the prince. Tori told his new friend that she cannot compare her to the princess, since she is much more beautiful. Lariat looked closely at the young maid of honor and said with a soft smile that she too was very beautiful. Lariat understood perfectly well that the young lady was much prettier and sweeter than the prince. Lariat looked at the young lady with a smile, as she felt as if she was playing with her missing little sister. Lariat smiled and told the young lady that she would be serving the princess with her from now on, so she asked her to take care of her. Tori sighed heavily and told the young lady that she shouldn't say such a thing to someone like her. Lariat looked at her in surprise and said with a smile that she did not understand what this meant, because the princess herself said that they were both ladies-in-waiting and they were equal. Tori embarrassedly told the young lady that, nevertheless, she was the daughter of a count. Lariat understood perfectly well that the prince trusted and cared only for Tori, and therefore she was on a higher level in the palace. The young lady, in turn, wondered whether she would now be able to get answers to all her questions. Lariat looked closely at the maid of honor and said with a smile that she had previously said that she had come to her birthday party instead of the princess. Tori was taken aback and embarrassedly said that it was so. Lariat looked closely at the young lady and said that she did not remember inviting the princess. She asked the maid of honor how she came to see her. Tori timidly said that the invitation was intended for Princess Nigel, but she secretly passed it on to Her Highness. Lariat understood perfectly well that the young lady simply stole the invitation. Tori, in turn, cried out and sheepishly asked the lady for forgiveness. Lariat looked tenderly at the young lady with a smile and said that she did not need to ask for forgiveness, because this place was for everyone. Lariat smiled and whispered that everything was fine, but she still wanted to ask why the lady had done this to her. Tori said that the princess wanted to tell the count something. Lariat was surprised by this turn of events. Tori said that she wanted to meet the count at the last council of aristocrats, but the count was not there. Lariat looked at the maid of honor in surprise and asked if she really came to celebrate her birthday. The lady timidly said that someone said that it would be interesting to take a look at it. Lariat looked at her in surprise and asked who she was talking about. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she sighed heavily and timidly said that she could not answer the question, and asked for forgiveness. Lariat wondered if she should continue and question the young lady. She sighed heavily as she knew that the lady would not answer her even if she began to trust her. A moment later she rose and, smiling, extended her hand to her new friend, said that it was time for them to go. She wanted to wait and watch them. Tori followed the young lady all the way to the room, but then had to escort her out. She fell onto her bed with a crash, as she was very tired. But she still understood perfectly well that she did not need to relax now, since she needed to put all her affairs in order. She knew the prince and her maid of honor got along much better than she had imagined, but she could see that the young lady was frightened, but not because of the prince. It seemed to her that perhaps they were even attached to each other in their own way, for example, through brotherly relations or family ties. She thought that something important would happen by the time the maid of honor became empress, but she was worried because she did not understand why the prince was interested in her family. Unfortunately, she didn't know the details, but he had been watching her family for a long time. She sighed heavily, because she knew that her father had never told her about the prince. Lariat sighed heavily, as she hoped that she would understand what to do next when she became the emperor's lady-in-waiting. But, unfortunately, she still didn't understand anything. She sighed heavily, as she wanted to cry loudly, but she still pulled herself together. A few months later, a beautiful spring came. She was 13, and the prince was 14. The prince turned out to be much calmer than she imagined. She was surprised because he was actually very quiet and he didn't do anything abrupt. But she was still puzzled, because she didn't understand why he would collect weapons if he didn't hunt. She knew that almost his entire budget, except for living expenses, went into his collection. He didn't like having maids following him around, and she only tasted his food during meals. She knew it was quite safe and freed her from having to test her food with silver. But she didn't know whether it was a deliberate attempt to mock her. But he was known as the queen's daughter, so there was no need to poison him. She didn't even know who could tolerate him with such a bad character. The princess looked at the young lady intently and asked if she had just appeared before her. Tasting the food, Lariat said that she had not looked at the princess at all. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to have lost weight because the clothes were too big. Lariat was furious because these clothes had always been too big for her. She sighed heavily and said that she had not lost weight. The princess sighed heavily and mockingly asked how she could lose weight if she ate her food. Lariat was furious but did not answer because it was the prince who told her exactly what to eat, and she always ate everything. For this reason, during lunch breaks, she just sits. Lariat looked closely at the prince because she knew that if she got fat, it would be his fault. Lariat looked at the princess with a radiant smile and asked if she liked the food. The princess sighed heavily and asked the young lady if she really wanted dumplings again. She told the lady that she had already tried everything. Lariat was furious as she realized that the prince was simply mocking her. But in turn, the young lady with a radiant smile said that she did not want this because she was already full of how he had an appetite, but he was eating. The princess sighed heavily and, while eating her food, asked if the young lady was accusing her of being hungry. Lariat looked at the princess with suppressed anger, but did not answer. Tori looked at them with a joyful smile and said that she was very pleased to see how close they had become. Lariat looked at her friend with a smile, but in her heart she was puzzled, since this did not look like a reproach meant at all. A moment later, she looked at her watch and realized she needed to bring the music teacher. After a few seconds, she bowed to the princess and said that she would go for the lord. The princess looked intently at her maid of honor and called her. Lariat looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she wanted. The princess looked at the young lady with fury and said that she had previously asked not to interrupt her. The princess asked the young lady if she could play any musical instruments. Lariat smiled and said that she could play the piano a little. The princess asked if she could sing. She smiled and said that her mother was a singer. The princess looked at the young lady mockingly and said that just because her mother sang well did not mean she could do the same. Lariat was furious, but in turn, with a gentle smile, said that she was not bad at this. She furiously wondered if he himself could sing. The princess told her naledi that then she should also stay, because she would sing along with her. The princess looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she was very bored and they could have some fun. Lariat, in turn, shuddered and tensed up at the princess's words. The princess looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked if she really didn't want it. With the speed of lightning, the young lady put a smile on her face and said that she really wanted to have fun. Lariat! As she left, she thought that the prince was still a monster in human form. Before she could even step out the door, she greeted the lord. The music teacher looked closely at the young lady and greeted her with a smile, saying that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he had met her mother a few days ago. He sighed heavily and said that Madame was very worried about her. He looked closely at the young lady and said that Madame said that she had not received any news from her. He asked if she would like to write a letter to her mother. The young lady, in turn, looked at the teacher with tears in her eyes. She missed her mother and her strong and tender hugs very much. She really wanted to tell her mother how hard it was for her, but she didn't know what excuse to come up with, because she left the house without permission. Walking down the corridor, she was very depressed. The man looked at the young lady with a smile and said that as a child he also often ran away from home. In this way, he wanted to support her a little. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with bewilderment, since she did not understand what he was saying at all. She sighed heavily and said that the princess was already waiting for them. He asked the young lady in surprise if she would come in too. He was surprised and at the same time puzzled, since he knew that the princess rarely kept her ladies-in-waiting near her, with the exception of the plebeian Tory. Lariat said with a smile that she would also come today. He felt it, sighed, and said that the princess was a very lonely girl, because this could be heard from her playing the piano. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she should support the princess with her singing. The young lady was shocked by the teacher's statement, as she knew that the prince was not alone at all because he was a monster, but unfortunately, she could not say anything in response. For some time, she watched the prince intently as he played. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she was amazed by the music. But a moment later, she froze in place from the juice, because she realized that his game was simply terrible. His game amazed her to the point of horror. She couldn't believe that the Lord compared his playing to loneliness. She sighed heavily, because she understood that she had to flatter his music-making. The prince looked haughtily at his maid of honor and asked how her performance was. She looked at him in surprise, as she knew he was trying to show off his game, but it was disgusting. She thought with a smile that his wonderful performance made her heart beat faster, but she said with a smile that his acting was not so good. The prince looked at the young lady with surprise and confusion and asked what she had just said. The young lady was taken aback as she realized that she had made a huge mistake. Lariat said that her heart was not feeling well after the princess's magnificent performance. She said that just a little more and she would burst into tears. The princess sighed heavily and said, "Young lady, that now she must sing." Lariat looked intently at the princess and, asking for forgiveness, said that she was afraid her singing would spoil her perfect performance. The princess looked intently at the young lady, but did not answer. Lariat sighed as she realized that her interference was not working. She was puzzled, because she understood that it was impossible to communicate with him without fawning. The young man, in turn, admired the princess's performance with a smile. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she also felt an energetic struggle in such performances. He said that he felt an unyielding spirit of passion, art that was permeated with loneliness. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand what he was even talking about, and at the same time called him simply crazy. She looked closely at the teacher and said that she would see him off now. He sighed heavily and said that he needed to come to his senses. She sighed heavily and wished him a good journey. Some time later, the young lady hurried him along behind the princess. Out of breath, she screamed and called for the princess. Unconsciously, the young lady reached out to the princess, but stopped when she realized that she had almost touched her hand. She looked at the princess intently and anxiously and asked where she was rushing to, especially without a maid of honor. The princess sighed heavily and asked the lady if she had really forgotten all the palace etiquette. The princess told the young lady to stop running and also told her not to laugh at her. Lariat smiled and asked the princess if she really thought she would become attached to her. The princess sighed heavily and said that she hated ugly creatures. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the prince because she knew that he was so handsome that he seemed unreal. She suddenly shuddered and found herself back in reality when she saw that the princess had moved away from her with the speed of lightning. Lariat was puzzled and shouted to the princess that they should go together. She was not in a hurry to follow the princess. The young lady knew that it was spring now, but it was still snowy in the capital. A moment later, she handed her cloak to the princess. The young lady told the princess with a gentle smile that she might catch a cold. The princess suddenly looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she was laughing at. The princess smiled and said that it was funny that she was treating her like a child. The lady smiled and told the princess that she was already a child. Lariat, in turn, gave him the coat out of good intentions. A moment later, she was shivering with cold as she noticed that it was much colder in the capital than in her home estate. The princess looked at the young lady closely and said that if she was cold, she could go back. The young lady was shocked because the prince told her this after he took her coat. She wondered if he was worried about her. The young lady told the princess with a smile that she could not let her wander alone. The princess looked closely at her maid of honor and said that in that case, she should stop nagging and making noise. Lariat was very angry, but she hid her emotions. She knew that everything was right, and the prince was simply incapable of worrying about someone. But she knew that they had made progress today, because they had talked a little. There had been even more conversations today than in the last few months. But in turn, she understood perfectly well that one cannot relax with him. But the young lady was happy with such a good achievement, but still she was a little nervous. A moment later, a young maid of honor appeared from behind the bushes with a cute animal in her arms. Lariat froze in place from the slag, as she was very frightened by the sudden appearance of her friend. She looked at the little animal in surprise and asked who it was. Tori said with a smile that it was a raccoon and that it was the princess's pet. She looked at them in surprise and asked if they really kept a raccoon as a pet. Tori smiled and said that it was not easy, but quite possible. She smiled and said that he was very gentle and kind. A moment later, Lariat was taken aback as she saw that her friend's hand was covered in bruises and bites. Lariat was tense, but she still began to treat the wound. She was shocked and did not understand how he could be gentle. Sighing heavily, the young lady said that he had bitten her hand. Tori looked at her friend with a gentle smile and said that everything was fine and she could handle it herself. She asked the young lady not to worry as she might get her outfit dirty. Lariat looked at her friend intently and said that unfortunately she could not fully treat her wound and she should return to the palace. Tori sighed heavily and said that she could not do this. Lariat was very surprised, but at the same time she sternly ordered her friend to go to the palace, as she knew that her wound was very serious. She told the maid of honor that she would certainly take care of the princess. The young lady, with tears in her eyes, said that she agreed and immediately left them. The princess looked intently at the maid of honor and said that she must go to the palace. Lariat looked at the princess with alarm and said that she too should be careful with the raccoon. Lariat understood perfectly well that now in front of her was a wild animal. Despite the cute appearance, they can be dangerous. She asked the princess if she was too close to him, but the princess said that he was very kind. The young lady was shocked by such statements because she saw her friend's hand. The princess, hugging her pet, said that he was hers, and therefore he was affectionate only with her. The young lady looked intently at the princess and said that she was her maid of honor and would follow only her. The princess looked at the lady intently and said that it was not so, and she was not hers. Lariat looked at the princess in surprise and asked why this was so, since she was her maid of honor. The princess sighed heavily and said that she owned very little, and she was not one of them. The princess came closer to the young lady very sharply and quietly said that she should not disturb her. The princess quietly said that at first glance she seemed helpless, but she could quickly and quietly kill a mouse or a bird. Lariat, in turn, was puzzled, because this was not what she was afraid of at all. She was afraid that he would turn into a monster. The young lady wondered what would happen if she decided to kill him. She knew that in that case, he would die easily. She understood perfectly well that he would die, because he was an ordinary mortal, like everyone else. But she still threw all her thoughts away and, looking at the young princess, said that she did not want to convince her at all. Sighing heavily, the young lady asked for forgiveness, as she did not mean to offend the princess. A moment later, the princess sighed heavily and sat down near the tree. The princess looked at her maid of honor in bewilderment and asked why she didn't leave. Lariat sighed heavily and, puzzled, asked where to go if the princess was here. The princess looked away from the young lady and asked if she was really stupid or just pretending. The young lady smiled and said, "Neither one nor the other." The princess looked at her maid of honor in surprise and asked if she was really being amused. Lariat smiled and said that this was not so. She sighed heavily, because she knew that if that were the case, he would behave differently. A moment later, the young lady called the princess and said that she was asking because she felt injustice. Lariat sighed heavily and asked the princess what she had done to displease her so much. She was appointed. She did not understand why the princess was so angry with her. The princess looked at the young maid of honor in surprise and asked if she really didn't know. Lariat pouted and said that she didn't know, that's why she was asking. The princess looked at her intently and said that she shouldn't be nice to Tori. The young lady froze in place for a moment in surprise. Lariat looked at the princess with bewilderment and said that she was very happy that at least one of the aristocrats was kind to her. She did not understand why she could not be nice and kind to Tori. The princess sighed and said that she knew very well how others looked at her, and therefore she asked her maid of honor not to pretend. Lariat understood perfectly well that as a member of the royal family, he cared for his lady-in-waiting. Lariat wondered if she was pretending. But in turn, she knew that, of course, there was pretense, because she was not so naive as not to take advantage of it. But still, the young lady did not hate her. It was only natural now that she felt awkward. The princess sighed heavily and told her maid of honor not to follow her around like a dog. She looked at the princess in surprise and said that she was her maid of honor, so she did not understand who she should follow if not the princess. The princess said that sooner or later she would go to the princess or the prince. The princess told the young lady that she didn't need to curry favor with her. Lariat looked at the princess in surprise and asked, what if she didn't want to do that? The princess with lightning speed turned around and looked at the young lady in surprise. She looked at the lady in surprise and asked why she didn't want to. The princess was surprised and did not understand why the young lady wanted to stay with her. She asked the lady if she was really that stupid. The young lady looked closely at the princess and said that she had already told her that her father spoke very highly of her. She asked the princess in surprise if she didn't believe her. Lariat sighed heavily and said that it wasn't necessary, because she just wanted to continue serving her. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she wanted to serve her so much. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the prince, as she understood that this was not even funny. She understood that it was very creepy, because he looked like an ordinary child, and it was disgusting for her, because she hated him with all her heart. She despised the prince. She knew that he was a natural-born monster in front of her now, so she understood that he shouldn't have revealed his human side to her. Lariat wondered what would happen when he turned into a merciless executioner. She did not understand why he treated his maid of honor so terribly. She silently begged him not to leave her to understand him. She wanted him not to force her to find an explanation for what he would become. She knew that he simply had to be a monster so that she could hate him in peace. Lariat feared and despised him so much that she was ready to kill him. Lariat looked at the princess intently and said that she only wanted to be of use to her. Lariat told the princess that even if she didn't like her, killing her was a waste of time. The princess sighed heavily and, looking intently at the young lady, said that she spoke as if she was already planning to kill her. Lariat understood perfectly well that he would not do it yet, but perhaps it would happen soon. The young lady looked at the princess intently and asked if she hadn't threatened to kill her. The princess hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The young lady, in turn, was very puzzled and did not understand how a helpless princess could kill a noblewoman. Lariat told the princess that her service to her had nothing to do with her family. She said that she wanted it herself, and also asked the princess if such an answer would suit her. She did not understand whether there were reasons for everything in the world. The young lady looked at the princess with a radiant smile and said that there are times when there are simply no reasons. The princess sighed heavily and, looking away from the young lady, asked if this was really her argument. The lady smiled and said that it was exactly like that, but in turn, she understood perfectly well that this was not so, because she was afraid and hated the prince. But she knew that she simply needed him to think so. She wanted him to see that she was on his side. She looked closely at the princess, because she understood perfectly well that this was the only way for her to survive with her family. A moment later, the young lady froze in place in surprise as she saw Prince Arnulf. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. Lariat bowed to the prince in response. She looked at the prince in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he pretended to be a stranger. She froze for a moment, as she saw that he was looking at the princess with fury and anger. She realized that the prince did not like the princess. She looked at the crown prince with a smile and asked how he was doing. The prince smiled and said that he did not know that she had arrived at the palace as a maid of honor. He said with a smile that she should have informed him or the princess, because they could have taken measures to accommodate her in their palaces. She smiled and said that there was no need for that, and also thanked the prince. The prince looked closely at the young lady, and with a gentle and radiant smile, said that the princess would be very upset if she found out about this, because she loved the young lady very much. The young lady was stunned, as she understood that he was using her to show off his dignity. She did not understand why he was trying to flirt with a little girl like her, because he was many times older than her. The young lady smiled and said that she apologized, but she still intended to continue serving the young princess. She looked at the prince in surprise and wondered if he really didn't believe her. Lariat knew that now he would have to take her word for it. The lady saw the prince's embarrassed face but said nothing, as she was happy in her soul. But a moment later, she froze in her tracks as the crown prince struck the young princess. A few minutes ago, the young lady said with a smile, that she would continue to serve the princess. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He was shocked by her statement, as he did not expect such a thing. Lariat looked at the prince intently and said that she wanted to serve Princess Lefert. The crown prince leaned closer to the young lady in shock. He asked with a grin if this was really the goal of her family. Mockingly, he said that the count was truly a stupid man. The young lady looked at the crown prince and said that she was only 13 years old. She did not understand how her action could mean anything to her family. She sighed heavily and wondered if she might have fallen out of favor with the future emperor of Inaction. But the young lady knew that in that case her family would be fine, because, unfortunately, she was not a man and could not inherit the title like her brother. She realized that her future was unstable, but the future of her family was also unstable. She understood perfectly well that the fate of her family was now in her hands, and it was entirely her responsibility. The princess grabbed her maid of honor with the speed of lightning and looked angrily at her brother. The young lady, in turn, looked at the prince in surprise, because she did not expect such a thing. The crown prince, mockingly, said that he had to go to the princess himself, because she ignored all the letters sent. The princess said that she had read them, because in them he had written that she should not have caught his eye, and she remembered it. He looked at her intently and asked if she understood why she was not following the rules. The princess told the prince that he had come to her first. The prince looked at the young princess with a mocking look, and then, a moment later, he slapped her across the face with fury. He looked at the princess with cold fury and said that she had become very willful lately, and, apparently, he had been too inattentive to her. The princess sighed heavily and said that she was not at all grieving and had not been eager to see him from the very beginning. Lariat, in turn, was shocked by the crown prince's actions. Lariat looked at the prince intently. She was puzzled and angry at the same time. The crown prince approached the young princess and asked what had finally captivated his majesty. He wondered if he had really liked the pretty face of the little girl. Lariat was shocked and could not believe that he had said this to his sister, who was many times younger than him. The prince, mocking his sister, asked if she was sure that his majesty's blood flowed through her. He said that she should be grateful to the imperial family that they accepted someone like her. He said with a grin that it was the mistake of the great William Belerium. Since the mother of the empire was no different from a prostitute, Lariat in turn was shocked by the prince's words. She did not understand why he hated the princess so much. She wondered if it was not because of the arrogance of power. She knew that it was not because of the throne. She looked at the prince intently, as she did not understand why everything was happening this way. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she knew that the Empress of Belerium was from the House of Ardell. The young lady froze for a moment in shock. The prince said that she was not the count's adopted daughter at all, but rather a toy. The prince said mockingly that, of course, she didn't know that. He looked at the young lady with a sharp and angry look and said that the count kept his mouth shut. The young lady was shocked because she realized that his father knew about everything. The prince looked at her with a grin and said that now that she knew, everything would fall into place. As he left, he said mockingly that he would tell someone to transfer the young lady to the princess's palace. Lariat rushed after the prince with the speed of lightning. But the princess grabbed the young lady by the hand and stopped her. The princess looked at the young lady with fury and said that she had previously said that they would leave. Lariat looked closely at the princess, and after a while she jerked her hand away. She sighed heavily and said that she would not go anywhere. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that she wanted to tell Pence that he didn't need to do that at all. Lariat looked at the princess intently and said that she would report this to the head manager. The princess in turn froze for a moment in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. Lariat was puzzled, because she saw that they were both a little injured. She looked closely at the princess and asked if she was in pain. A moment later, the princess took the young lady by the hand and handed her a small jar of ointment. Lariat froze for a moment, as she saw in front of her the ointment that her brother used when he entered the military academy. The proprietary brand of a capital pharmacist was said to hold a lot of holy water. It was also called tiger ointment. The young lady looked at the small box with great admiration, as she knew it was for the royal family, so it was genuine. She remembered that she had previously promised herself to be more extravagant when she came to the palace. Lariat looked at the princess with a joyful smile and asked if she could use it. Without waiting for an answer, she thanked the princess. The princess looked closely at the young lady as she applied the ointment to the wound, sighing heavily. The princess said that the ointment was too expensive. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that she knew this and named the approximate cost for one jar. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had really just used it all. Lariat looked closely at the princess and said that it was all because her body was more fragile. She told the princess that she was strong, although thin, but when you touched her strongly, it began to burn her skin. And besides, there was still a large mark left. The young lady looked at the princess intently, wondering if she felt guilty. Lariat was furious. She looked at the princess with cold eyes and said that it was too late for apologies, and she had already killed her. She was furious and wanted to know if the prince had any common sense, because she knew that he had killed many people. She asked angrily if he regretted scratching her wrist because he couldn't control his power. She wished she could say it that way, but still, her dry, heavy face stared at the princess and asked if she really regretted it. The princess looked at the lady with indignation and asked if it was really she who was sorry. She told the lady that the problem was that her skin was damn soft. She did not understand why she would be sorry. Lariat looked closely at the prince, as she understood that he was a child, but still he could not lie. Lariat immediately handed her a jar of ointment and told her that she should apply it to her body. The princess was momentarily dumbfounded with surprise. The princess said that she didn't need to do it at all. Lariat told the princess that if she didn't do it, she would get a bruise. She told the princess that she needed to take care of her body. The princess turned around with lightning speed and told the lady to quickly get out of the way. Lariat looked at the princess in surprise and intently. Lariat understood that there was too much information for her now. The empress was a slave. Usually the mother of an empire comes from the family of a duke or marquis, or from the royal family of another country. But for the empress, the mother of the empire, to be not even a commoner, but a slave, is not just a scandal involving the imperial family, but a serious incident that could cause an uprising of the nobility. The young lady in the publishing house stripes did not understand why her father kept his mouth shut then. She did not understand that I was like this with a man who adhered to the old and familiar foundations. She was at a loss and wondered why the queen was still alive if the crown prince was such a talkative man. She knew the emperor could stop everything, but she wondered why he hadn't shown up yet. She knew very well that the emperor had a good relationship with her father. He was the emperor's son, not an enemy. He naturally became the emperor when the crown prince died of illness, having strong support. She wondered if the emperor's love was that great. The young lady knew that this was true, because the emperor had enough power to turn a slave into an empress. But she was puzzled by the fact that the prince was abandoned, despite the fact that he was the child of the empress, who was loved madly. The young lady, in turn, wondered if the crown prince had made a mistake. She was furious, because she knew that she needed to meet her father as soon as possible, because she knew that if she acted rashly, she would ruin everything. She thought for a moment, and remembered that her brother would soon be going to a military academy. The modern lady was never able to attend the opening ceremony in her past life. The young man stood quietly at the door and watched what had come running in different directions. He was puzzled, because his sister was proud of the pain. In her past life, she was struck down by a severe illness that forced her to lie in bed for a long time. Then he looked at his sister with bitterness and asked her not to get sick, and also said that he would return soon. Lariat was shocked because she realized, and now in a difficult life, she did not even say goodbye to her brother. She was sure that this time she would congratulate him properly. She was proud of her younger brother because he was entering a military academy that was difficult to get into. She became alone. If she gets promoted, she will be able to go to work and back with her brother. Lariat sighed heavily and began to think about living together. She knew that it would not be as awkward as before, because she thought that this time they would be able to get along. Lariat knew very well that there was nothing more important than family. She sighed heavily, as she hoped that her brother would still understand her actions. She was looking forward to their meeting. She alone knew that it was only spring, and she still had a lot of time left. Ever since the border with the prince disappeared, she followed Tori and Rupert without reservation. She was glad that where there was a beautiful day, she was even praised. But she knew that the prince did not trust her completely. But fortunately, the lady improved a lot. She had been worried about the crown prince ever since, but she thought Rupert didn't seem to care. She knew that even if she couldn't avoid the bullying, she had to accept it so that the prince god would trust her even more. She looked closely at the little child who would one day be the emperor. She knew she wouldn't have to pull the strings. He just needed to see it. She stared at the young man and wondered how many people had died at his hands. A moment later, Tori approached the young lady and asked her to take care of her raccoon. Lariat was puzzled and did not understand why she should do this, because he was looking at her angrily the whole time. Tori said with a smile that the princess was sleeping now, and therefore she should take care of him. The young lady pushed hard, but still agreed. Tori said with a gentle smile that perhaps the hot weather had prevented the princess from getting a good night's sleep. Tori looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was feeling well these days. Lariat was very excited because she did not understand why the maid of honor asked her about something like this so suddenly. She stood dumbfounded and looked at her friend in surprise. But a moment later, with a joyful smile, She said that she had slept very well, without any problems. Tori approached the young lady and said with a smile that it was very good, while she removed the paper from behind her face. But a moment later she was stunned with embarrassment, as they were very close to each other. Tori cried out sheepishly that it was very good that the young lady had slept well that night. She cried out that it was time for her to go, as she wanted to take a bath. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in surprise. A moment later, she looked at the raccoon with a puzzled look and asked him not to twitch. She sighed heavily and told him that she didn't like him either. The young lady was surprised because he was very noisy. She looked at the prince in surprise, as the raccoon was too noisy, but this did not prevent the prince from sleeping quietly. She looked closely at the sleeping prince, because she realized that if he got hurt in front of her, she would feel guilty. She knew that this was a very strong feeling that could save him. A moment later, the raccoon hit the young lady. She was taken aback in a way she had not expected. With lightning speed, he escaped from her tenacious grip. The young ladies, in turn, froze in shock, not understanding what had happened. The raccoon looked at the prince with a radiant smile. The prince cried out nervously, because he did not understand what had happened. A moment later, he looked at the young lady with cold fury and anger and asked if she really wanted to die. She was taken aback and froze, better yet, in place, since she did not understand how it all happened. He looked at her with cold fury, asking who gave her the right to wake him up. The young lady shouted at the princess that she wouldn't even be able to get married because of the raccoon. He looked at her with a smirk and said that she would not be able to return with such a wound. She looked at him in surprise, because she did not understand why he was saying such a thing. The prince looked at the young lady with a grin and said that it was all because she looked like a dumpling. The young lady looked at the prince with fury, but a moment later she froze, as she saw that he was truly handsome. She sighed heavily, as she felt very sad when she thought about dumplings. He looked at her intently and said that she should come to him. The young lady with a radiant smile hurried to the prince, but in her heart she hated him and did not want to come closer. The princess looked at the young lady with indignation and told her not to laugh. A moment later, the princess handed the young lady a jar of ointment. She asked with a grin if she would really not hear any gratitude this time. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was immensely grateful to the princess. The princess looked at the young lady with fury and asked if that was sarcasm on her part just now. The lady smiled and said that it was not so, and she was very grateful. The princess said that she was worried that the dumplings might explode in her cheeks. A moment later, the young lady was happily applying the ointment to her face. She slowly handed the jar to the princess when she was done. The princess sighed heavily and asked how she could use what she had already used. The young lady was taken aback and said that she was pure. She knew that she was pure, unlike the prince. The princess sighed heavily and said that the jar was no longer clean and she should just use the ointment. The young lady smiled and did not thank the princess. Lariat, in turn, wondered if she should save some ointment for later. She sighed heavily, because she knew that today she had to be extravagant. She wanted to enjoy her wealth to the fullest. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled, because she knew very well that together with her friend, she had done all the hard work, and the prince was now just sitting and playing with the raccoon. Looking at the raccoon, he reminded her of the man who constantly fawned on the prince. She looked at the princess closely and said that the raccoon was very friendly towards her. The princess said that it was all because he was her pet. Lariat thought for a moment, as she knew that Tori would come first, and then the raccoon. She wondered if she could gain his favor if she acted the same way. The princess looked closely at the young lady and asked how Tori was. Lariat was taken aback as she did not expect such a question. She said that the girl had a stomach ache. Lariat was shocked as she saw that he was really worried about the maid of honor. Lariat sighed heavily and told the princess that she must really like the maid of honor. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said that it was not really so. Lariat, in turn, understood that, even if only a little, he was inclined to love a woman, so he kept Tori near him all day. She knew that he was embarrassed because he was going through puberty. Lariat slowly sat down closer to the princess and said with a smile that she liked the maid of honor. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked with a grin what made her think so. The young lady said that she did not know what she liked about the maid of honor, and also said that if the princess continued to sit in this position, she would be able to see the clothes under her skirt. The princess, in turn, calmly said that the young lady could look if she wanted. The young lady, in turn, was persistent and told the princess that she should not sit like that. The princess sighed heavily and said that there was no point in talking about etiquette when her clothes were already on the dirty ground. The young lady sighed heavily as she had no more arguments. A moment later, she said that it was true that the princess was worried about the young lady in waiting. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked if she really had to like everything that she had to worry about. Lariat looked at her in surprise and asked if it wasn't usually the other way around. She looked at the princess intently and said that she usually takes care of what she loves. The princess froze in place for a moment. The princess looked at the young lady closely and said that just because she loved something didn't mean she cared about it. Lariat looked at the princess in surprise and said that if she loved something, she should take care of it. The princess looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked what about her. The lady smiled and said that she was sure many people did the same. Lariat was puzzled because she did not understand what was wrong with loving. The princess sighed and said that she thought she did not act like that for the most part. Lariat looked at the princess in surprise and asked how it was. The princess looked away from the young lady and said that she only valued what belonged to her. Lariat was surprised and at the same time puzzled because she understood that he shared it as if he was in another world. The princess looked intently at the lady and said that it didn't matter at all whether she liked something or not. Lariat understood that he wanted to take care of everything that belonged to him. Lariat was puzzled, as she was at an impasse. With the speed of lightning, the young lady rushed to the princess and asked if Tori really belonged to her. She knew that loving and appreciating did not mean appropriating. It sounded as if she appreciated something simply because she happened to own it. The princess looked at the young lady with irritation and told her to move away. Lariat looked at the princess with worry and asked what was wrong with her. She knew that her words now sounded bold and ridiculous because she wanted to win over the man she hated with all her soul. She sighed heavily, as she simply could not believe that she had been so impatient. Lariat was very scared, as she realized that her stupidity had gone too far. The princess looked at the young lady mockingly and said that she would never be of any value to her. The young lady was shocked. She said that she was her maid of honor. The princess said that she was just a maid of the royal palace. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she had been assigned to her. Lariat asked excitedly, what if she said that she herself wanted to become her maid of honor? The princess looked intently at the young lady and her son and said sternly that she would not believe her. Lariat froze in shock, as she had not expected such a thing. She was puzzled, because the prince still did not believe her. She did not understand why he was so adamant. The young lady, in turn, looked intently into the distance with a joyful smile on her face. She suddenly turned around because she heard someone calling her, and so she was left in pitch darkness. She froze in shock and wondered what was going on, because she knew she was dead until that moment. She knew she had never held a man's hand before. A moment later, she opened her eyes and sighed heavily, as she had difficulty falling asleep. She looked at her friend in surprise, as she was furious that she had woken her up. But a moment later, Tori Shi rushed at the young lady and shouted. Lariat was shocked, because she did not understand what was happening. Tori looked at her friend with tears in her eyes and said that something was wrong with the princess. Tori was very worried because she saw that the princess was having a nightmare and couldn't breathe. Lariat, with the speed of lightning, came closer to her friend and tenderly hugged her, asked her not to cry and to calm down. In turn, the young lady was a little worried because her friend said that the prince could not sleep. She wondered if the reason was really nightmares and not the hot weather. Lariat asked the girl if she had tried to wake up the princess. The young lady said that she had been unable to do so. She was worried because she saw that the princess could not wake up because she had a fever and a high temperature. Lariat knew that first they needed to prepare antipyretics and pills for the princess. Lariat had previously bought expensive medicine because she was feeling unwell, Tori hurriedly shouted to the young lady to hurry up and go quickly to the princess. Lariat was well aware that the medicines were very expensive and valuable, so they should only be taken when absolutely necessary. She was furious because she knew that the prince would pay her for it. A moment later, they entered the princess's room and noticed that she was feverish. Lariat slowly walked closer to the prince, and for a moment she froze with a grin on her face. With the speed of lightning, she suppressed her laughter. She sighed heavily and looked at the prince intently, as she simply could not believe that she was happy to see a sick man. Milady slowly leaned towards the prince. She was gloating, so she knew that everything happened because of him. She understood perfectly well that he was simply a monster, the only culprit of everything that happened before her. She knew that even if it didn't happen now, he killed her, and it was only his fault. Lariat froze for a moment and wondered if he would survive even if she didn't save him now. She hoped he would just die. Tori, with lightning speed, approached her friend and called her. She was puzzled and wanted her friend to quickly give the medicine to the princess. Tori, with tears in her eyes, reached out to the young lady and asked if she was okay. Lariat. She smiled a gentle smile and said that she was fine. She was just a little surprised. She asked her friend how long the princess had been in this state. Tori sighed heavily and said that these nightmares began a long time ago. The young lady was puzzled because she knew that this was the first time she had a fever and difficulty breathing. Lariat slowly approached the prince. She felt the heat from him. After a short procedure, the princess studied. They looked at her with concern and asked if she was okay, and also asked if they should call a doctor. The princess, breathing heavily, looked intently at the lady and said that they must leave quickly. Lariat looked closely at the princess and said that she had brought her some fever reducers. Her mother had given them to her, but she was sure that they would help her as well. The young lady, in turn, pretended to be patient and told Gavrilov that she was very sorry, but the princess turned away from her, not wanting to hear anything. A moment later, the young lady in the game told the princess that her fever was subsiding. The young lady, with the speed of lightning, gave the princess the medicine and asked her to swallow it, but the princess spat out the medicine. The young lady, with the speed of lightning, pushed the medicine back. The princess was furious, but still obeyed. Lariat looked at the princess with concern and said that she did not know how serious a nightmare had to be for the temperature to rise and sweat to flow like a stream. The princess angrily told the young lady not to interfere and called her maid of honor. Lariat, looking at the lady, asked her to bring some water. Lariat looked at the young lady and asked her to hurry up. Tori looked at them worriedly, but still did what she was told to do. Lariat swallowed the medicine in front of the princess with the speed of lightning and asked if she really thought it was poison. She wanted to show the princess that it was just medicine. In turn, the princess slowly obeyed and swallowed the medicine. Lariat, with a gentle smile, touched the princess's hand and said that she should not be shy, showing her weak side. She smiled and said that there was nothing humiliating in this because she also often had nightmares. She dreamed of a prince who took her brother and father away from her, a terrifyingly real nightmare. She was furious and wanted him to remember that it was she who saved him today, because she hoped that he would save her and her family's lives. Sometime later, the young lady asked the princess with a smile if she was comfortable. She smiled and said that the antipyretic consisted of valuable components, so it was very expensive. She sighed heavily and said that she was just saying this to lighten the mood. She knew that her friend had said earlier that the prince had not slept for several days, although now he fell asleep quite quickly. Lariat looked closely at her friend and said that she could go back to bed, because today she could take care of the princess. Tori was taken aback, because she did not expect anything like this. She said that she simply could not leave all this to her. Lariat looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she meant, since she was well aware that it was her duty, like a maid of honor, to talk about the princess. Tori said excitedly that usually the princess does not keep anyone near her at night. Lariat smiled tenderly and said that today they would make an exception. She looked closely at her friend and said that she was very sleepy and therefore could go and rest. The young lady sheepishly told her friend that in that case she would relieve her at dawn. As she left, The young lady bowed low to her friend and left. Lariat noticed that the girl was very good at bowing, but not at etiquette. Lariat turned and looked closely at the prince, because she understood that even in the face of death he did not trust her. She knew that the reason was in her father, because he did not trust him. Lariat was well aware that her father was keeping a secret that was a threat to the prince's position. She understood that this information was a burden for her father, because she knew that he was not a cunning schemer at all. She knew that her aunt thought that Lord Ventivolt would be next in line to the throne. The young lady wondered if her aunt wanted to become a concubine. She sighed heavily, because she knew that most likely this was not the case. But first she needed to meet with this aunt. She was very angry with herself because she knew that she needed to study politics, or at least scout out the territory. She understood that she was very weak and could not do anything. She looked at the prince with fury, because she understood that she could only leave all this to the monster who killed her with his own hands. She looked intently at the prince, not taking her eyes off him, as she saw that he was now helpless in front of her. Lariat looked at the prince intently and quietly muttered that he should trust her, because she did not want to betray him. She quietly begged him to do so. A moment later, the young lady opened her eyes and stared into the distance with a joyful smile on her face, while she was confused and did not know if it was a dream. She smiled and said with pride that she loved Valois. Lariat understood that this was her dream, because she had never had a man. She looked away from the young man in embarrassment, as she saw that he was looking at her with a gentle smile. A moment later, she felt someone take her hand, but she realized that her hands were small. She sighed heavily because she thought it was very strange, but a moment later she realized that someone was calling her. Opening her eyes, she stood dumbfounded on the spot, as she saw the prince hugging her and holding her hand. He looked at her with fury and told her to leave quickly. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not yet woken up. The prince said angrily, "Young lady, that she must leave immediately." A moment later, she realized what was happening and froze in shock. A few seconds later, the young lady fell to the ground with a thud. She was puzzled, wondering if she had gone crazy. With the speed of lightning, she stood up and shouted to the prince that she was very sorry because she had not done this on purpose. It seemed to her that it was very cold at night. She consoled herself and wondered if she had really snored at night. She was puzzled because she understood that he would simply kill her. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that she was simply a fool. Bowing low, the young lady asked for forgiveness, as she was only sleepy and therefore inadvertently did such a thing. He sighed heavily and said that she should forget about it and should call his lady-in-waiting. Lariat rose from the ground with the speed of lightning and said that she would do everything. But a moment later, the princess noticed that her maid of honor had already arrived. Tori walked up to the princess with lightning speed. The princess, in turn, began to stroke Tori's head. The young lady looked at them in surprise, as it seemed to her that her friend looked like a cute puppy. Lariat asked the princess with a smile if she was feeling better. The princess said irritably that next time, no matter what happened, they should never come into her room in the middle of the night. Lariat's face sank and she looked at the prince with disgust. Tori looked intently at the princess and said that she needed to thank her lady-in-waiting. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Tori smiled and said that it was only thanks to the medicine that the young ladies brought that her fever quickly subsided, and she took care of the princess all night long. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not expect anything like this at all. Lariat said with a happy smile that her body was quite weak, so she had medicine in case of anything. She smiled and told the princess that she could inform her again when she refused the services of the imperial physician. Lariat said that the princess did not trust her even after taking her medicine, and this completely dismissed her. She approached the princess with a smile and called her. The princess was taken aback. She did not understand why the young lady was looking at her like that and laughing. She was confused, because she did not know what her Naledi needed. Lariat, with a joyful smile, said that she was very glad that she felt better. The princess was taken aback and shouted that she would pay for all the medicines, so she did not need to show off. Lariat looked at the princess in surprise, and asked if she could not boast that the princess had given her money. The princess looked angrily at the young lady and said that she was very impudent. Lariat looked at the princess with a joyful smile and said that she was joking. She asked the princess if she really thought that she really needed money from her. Lariat told the princess with a joyful smile that she was only her maid of honor. The princess looked at the young lady with fury and said that she should not make her laugh, and even asked what she wanted. Lariat smiled and told the young princess that she was her maid of honor and that she did not need anything. The princess angrily asked her subordinate if she really considered her a fool who did not know her own maid of honor. She looked at the lady intently and asked what she really wanted. Lariat froze in place for a moment in shock as the prince called her his own maid of honor. The young lady smiled and told the princess that if she insisted, she would like to express her wish. She asked the princess if she could go out one day to the city. The princess looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she needed to go to the city. The young lady, not hearing the question, said that the medicines she gave the princess were very expensive. The princess angrily hit her fist and the pillow and asked if she should pay for the medicine after all. Lariat smiled and said that her younger brother was entering the military academy in the capital, so she would like to see him. The princess was surprised that the young lady was so worried about her brother. Lariat sighed heavily, because she understood that she would not be able to go out into the city if he refused. Lariat missed her family very much, but she could not arouse suspicion. The princess looked at her closely and said that she could go. Lariat was surprised, but at the same time very happy. She thanked the princess with a smile for her kind gesture. The princess, in turn, was very annoyed. She told her lady-in-waiting to leave quickly. Some time later, the young lady happily went about her business. She was very happy, since her wallet was full. She understood that there were still benefits to working as a maid of honor around the clock. She looked around because she wanted to know which coachman had the lowest fare to the academy. A moment later, she saw a stall with flowers and wanted to buy some for the ceremony. She wondered if she could buy a bouquet of daffodils. Upon entering the store, the young lady saw Madame. Madame smiled and asked the young lady if she was going to an important event. Lariat said with a happy smile that she was going to her younger brother's entrance ceremony into the military academy. The madam smiled and said that her brother was a great guy because it was very difficult to get there. She smiled and said that even in childhood, everyone noted his ability to wield a sword, and he was very smart. Lariat said with a joyful smile that her brother was a very nice young man. True, he was very sensitive and quick-tempered, but he was quite friendly and kind, and he was very good at his studies. Madame listened to the young lady with a joyful smile. A moment later, the young lady glanced sideways at the small flower pot beside her. While collecting a bouquet of flowers, the lady said with a smile that the flower was charming when it was in bloom. The lady smiled and said that this freesia is given to him when they want to congratulate him on a new endeavor. The young lady was surprised, as she had not heard of the flower before. Lariat said with a smile that she would take it too. She knew that the impulse purchase was a good thing, because now she realized that she was being wasteful, and she was good at it. The madam smiled and looked sideways at the young lady and said that it seemed that her brother was very handsome, good with a sword, and also very smart, so it was amazing. The young lady looked at the madam in surprise and asked how she knew that her brother was very handsome. Lariat joyfully shouted that her brother was very handsome and that he was the most handsome man in the whole city. Madam smiled and, looking at the young lady, said that she was very small, which meant her brother was too. Madam saw a very good young lady in front of her. Lariat froze in place for a moment from embarrassment. Lariat shyly covered herself with the little flower, as she was very embarrassed by her words. Madam smiled and said that she added more daffodils to the bouquet because of her beauty. The madam smiled and asked the young lady what kind of bough she would choose for the flowers. The young lady smiled and said that she would like a dark brown bow because it matched the color of her brother's eyes. A moment later, Madam smiled and told the young lady that her order was ready. Lariat beamed and thanked Madam for the superb bouquet of flowers. The young lady, after some time, slowly approached the carriage because Madam had told her that this autocar was the cheapest one. Madam told the young lady that the carriage had to be driven by herself. Lariat knew that she was still a newbie in this kind of thing, but she hoped that she could handle it. A moment later, the young man ran up to the young lady and told her the price of the carriage rental. After some time, they began to bargain among themselves. After some time, the young lady was riding towards her brother with a joyful smile, while the man was bursting into tears as he knew he needed to ask for more. With the speed of lightning, the young lady rushed towards her brother. Belurnia's only prestigious military academy, the Blue Eagle representing the Empire-occupied kingdom of Villatan, the symbol of the military academy, the beast defeated by the Empire, now became a pet that protected Belurnia, all because of the current emperor's arrogant attitude. But nevertheless, the young lady knew that the military academy was a prestigious school full of talented students. She knew that the place where her brother was admitted was simply incredible. She looked into the distance with a joyful smile, since, unfortunately, she had not seen him in a school uniform this year. She was well aware that he looked cute in his military uniform. A moment later, she was distracted by a knock on the door. The man, after apologizing, asked the young lady if he could verify her identity. A moment later, the young lady handed him her token. He looked at her closely and thanked her for her assistance. She froze for a moment as she saw the young man who was in uniform. The young lady was delighted with his figure and good body. She was curious how strong he was. She was confused. She looked away from him, because it was all because of her dreams. She was puzzled, because the faceless man continued to come to her in her dreams. The young man looked at the young lady with doubt. He looked at her closely and asked if she was a relative of Cadet Luhan Valois. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he knew her brother. He said that he knew, since he was the first cadet of the academy, but he was told that no one from the young man's family would be attending the opening ceremony. The young lady looked at the young man with a radiant smile and said that she was the young man's sister and had arrived in the place of her father and mother. The young man looked at the lady in surprise as he saw her beautiful brown hair and realized that she belonged to the family. He smiled and said that he understood everything and also said that he would park her carriage. She smiled and thanked him. A moment later, Milady was already in the hall, but she was worried because she did not know how to find her brother. A moment later, the knight thanked everyone for coming to welcome the new cadets. Lariat watched the ceremony intently, keeping her eyes on the knights as she searched for her brother. She looked into the distance in surprise and wondered if her brother had not been among the new recruits. She was shocked and wondered if he hadn't come to the opening ceremony. She was worried that he might have simply been offended that no one had come to see him and would have started to hate his family. But a moment later, she noticed her brother in the distance. The young lady froze for a moment as her brother was about to give his speech. She looked at her brother with embarrassment, as he looked great in his new form. A moment later, the young man began to deliver his speech, but suddenly froze in mid-speech. The young lady, in turn, joyfully called out loudly to her brother and shouted that her brother was the best. The young man looked at his sister in surprise and froze for a moment. With the speed of lightning, he finished his speech. The man was in shock because he saw that the young man was leaving with the speed of lightning. He did not understand what he was doing at all. The man shouted at the recruits one last time that Luhan Valois had just spoken to them. Everyone present looked at the young recruit in bewilderment. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her brother, admiring his beauty. Luhan jumped onto the balcony where his sister was standing with lightning speed. The young lady froze in place from the silk, as she did not expect this. She was shocked and excited. Lariat asked her brother if he was really a little monkey. She understood that he had acted very recklessly and made a very dangerous move. But a moment later, she threw herself into his arms with a joyful smile and congratulated him on his admission. The young man looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked who she was. She smiled and asked if he was surprised. Taken aback, he asked if it was really his sister who was in front of him now. She smiled and said that she didn't even know, and he had to tell her if it was true that she was his sister. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had just smiled. Lariat looked at her brother in bewilderment and asked if he was angry. He sighed heavily and said that he was not angry. A moment later, he hugged his sister tightly and asked if she had any idea how worried they all were about her well-being. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he hadn't seen her letter. The young man pulled away from his sister and asked what letter they were talking about. He looked at his sister with a worried and puzzled expression and asked if she would like it if he left the house, leaving only a letter. He was very worried about his sister and asked if she didn't understand how dangerous it was in the capital. Lariat froze for a moment, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. She realized that he was very worried about her. He was shocked that she went to the imperial palace without a shadow of a doubt. He looked closely at his sister and asked what it was about their family that made her so dissatisfied that she decided to run away. He didn't understand why she didn't contact him. He sighed heavily and said that his father and mother could be frightening even for him. Luhan looked at his sister with a puzzled expression and said that she should have told him what was bothering her so much. The young lady was shocked. She didn't know how shocking it could be for her little brother. Now she realized that it was very hard for him after she left. With lightning speed, she hugged her brother and asked for forgiveness because she felt terrible, sorry that she had acted this way. Lariat looked closely at her brother and said with a smile that she could not even think about such a thing, but now she would definitely keep in touch with him. She once again asked her brother for forgiveness. He sighed heavily and said that he was sorry that he had made such a fuss. The young lady looked at her brother with a joyful smile as he looked at her. She was very glad that she was able to resolve the misunderstanding between them. She remembered again that the family was her burden, but she also knew that this was her greatest happiness. A moment later, she heard a loud whisper around her. The young man slowly turned around, pulling his sister by the hand. She, alarmed, shouted to her brother that they should return to the opening ceremony. She shouted to her brother that he should go to the ceremony immediately. He said with a smile that he would do everything, and the son jumped from the balcony with the speed of lightning. She was puzzled because she knew he was in trouble because of her. But a moment later, she froze in shock as she saw her brother fighting back against his superiors. She flinched and froze in shock as the young knight struck her brother on the head. She flushed with anger because she didn't understand what the bad guy was doing to her brother. A moment later, they turned around and flinched as they saw the young lady flushed with anger. The young man looked at the young lady with a puzzled smile and quickly put the cap on the young man. Luhan looked at his sister with a gentle smile. The young lady, for her part, was a little upset. She understood that even if this military academy was cruel, it was still there. She felt uneasy and worried about her brother. After the ceremony was over, the young lady stood quietly and waited for her brother. The young man ran up to his sister with the speed of lightning and called her with a smile. She was worried, looked at her brother and asked who was the guy who hit him. She didn't understand why he did that and was very angry. Luhan, looking at his sister, said that Cadet Bliss was with him then, and he was the senior in rank. He looked at his sister with a smile and said that she did not need to worry, as this was a very good place. Young lady, you in turn did not want to let go of such a cheese-like hand. She shouted that the cadet had no idea what a huge mistake he had made. She was shocked and couldn't understand how she could not be worried if there was violence in the academy. Luhan looked at his sister intently and said that it was not so, and he did this because of what he did earlier. The young lady was irritated. She did not understand why the cadet took it out on her brother. The young man looked at his sister with a joyful smile and laughed tenderly. She froze in surprise, looking at her brother. She remembered being told that she was not allowed to laugh, Madam asking her if she understood this. With tears in her eyes, the young lady said that she understood everything. She turned around with lightning speed and, looking at her brother, screamed that he was laughing, just covering his mouth with his hands, and that it was not fair. Years later, the imperial dog came to them. They wanted to capture the next heir of the Count's family. The young man, with the speed of lightning, shielded his sister with his body. Luhan was confused and screamed, with tears in her eyes, asking him to leave her brother alone. Bursting into tears, she said that her brother was completely innocent and they could not take him away. The emperor's dog looked closely at the young people and ordered his subordinates to take everyone away. She was shocked when she saw her father, because he was covered in bruises. With tears in her eyes, she screamed at them that they couldn't do this. Luhan sighed heavily and called his sister. He said that he wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, but he knew that it was not. With the last of his strength, he smiled tenderly at his beloved sister. He looked intently at his sister, who was bursting into tears, and tenderly whispered that everything would be fine. Luhan looked at his sister intently and asked her to give him his luggage with a smile. She smiled and asked if he had really become a noble knight. He looked at her in surprise and said that a man should always be a knight. She smiled and said that he had not even received this position, but he already spoke so well. They walked leisurely around the outskirts of the academy. The young lady said with a smile that he should now tell about himself. She smiled and asked if everything was okay with him. He looked at his sister intently and with surprise and told her that everything was okay with him. She didn't need to worry. She froze for a moment as she saw that he answered her a little coldly. Lariat was puzzled because she didn't know what she should say. She was shocked because she had not seen him at this moment in her past life. A moment later, the young man smiled and told his sister that she could sit down. She looked at him in surprise and said that he should put his jacket back on because it was very cold. He looked at her in surprise and said that it was the middle of summer, but she did not listen to him and sat down with the speed of lightning. They sat on the bench for a while, and she asked him many questions. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and asked if her parents were really that worried about her. He looked at her closely and said that it was exactly like that. She sighed heavily, and from that day, the look from her brother said that she had a plan. He looked at her in surprise and asked if a person who had a plan would leave the house so rashly. Lariat sighed heavily and drooped. She quietly told her brother that she could not tell him everything now, but still she had good reasons. He looked at his sister intently and said that he knew it. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at his sister with a smile and said that she was not the type to do something without thinking. With lightning speed, the young lady hugged her brother, as she had liked him very much in his younger years. She knew perfectly well that he would not be able to say something like that as an adult. She sighed heavily and felt sad for a moment, because she didn't know if she should ask him something. She didn't like it. It looked conditional. She was using him. Lariat looked at her brother intently and said that, in that case, she would ask for something. The young lady smiled and told her brother that if anything happened, he should write to her. He asked in surprise if she was really leaving already. She said that he had to go to training. He said in surprise that she shouldn't leave. Lariat asked in irritation if he really wanted to get into trouble again. The young man took his sister by the hand and said that she didn't have to go. She froze in place for a moment. A moment later, she saw his gaze and sighed heavily, because she saw that he was very cute. He looked at her intently, as he wanted to be close to her. The young lady smiled and, stroking his head, said that she would certainly protect him. She sighed heavily and said that that was why he should let her go. He sighed heavily but still agreed with her. She could see that he was upset. Lariat came closer to him, and with a smile said that he should let her go. He looked away and embarrassedly said that he would let her go now. Luhan looked at his sister closely and gently said that she would be in trouble if she lied to him. She looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile how she could leave after his words. He sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness. She looked closely at her brother, as she realized that it must have been very difficult for him to be separated from his family at such a young age. But she knew what he had, so as long as she was around, he was safe. Lariat looked at her brother with a tender smile and said that she would be back soon. He asked her to come every week. She sighed heavily and said that she would try to come twice a month. He smiled and said that was not bad either. A moment later, the young lady said goodbye to her brother and slowly walked back. He looked intently after his sister. Some time later, she was wandering around the city. She looked around in surprise and noticed that the man from whom she bought dumplings last time was not there. She wondered if he had taken the day off. The young lady sighed angrily because she understood that she could not do anything. She would have to buy dumplings somewhere else. A moment later, she approached the madam and bought some dumplings from her. She thought with a smile that it was funny that they had a fight over dumplings, since they were simple street food. Looking around, she noticed that the busy street was full of people and shops. Most of her family's family business was destroyed by the emperor. Then they lost everything, unfortunately. She knew how scary the capital would become in the future, and it was very terrible. She looked closely at the maid and asked where Richie was. The maid smiled and said that the young lady should return soon. A moment later, the young lady looked at the small windmill in surprise and asked the maid what power it was running on. The maid smiled and said that it was all thanks to the energy obtained from the burning of Prow. Lariat asked in surprise if the cool wind was also caused by this energy. The maid smiled and said that it was correct. The young lady sighed heavily, as she now even felt sorry for the frogs, as they were dying in agony. She sighed heavily, as she was troubled by the conversation she had had with her brother earlier. She looked closely at her brother and asked if her father had told him anything about the imperial family. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she asked about such a thing. She sighed heavily and said that she had her own reasons. The young man, taken aback, said that his father had not told him much. She looked at him intently and asked if he was hiding something. Luhan anxiously asked why she didn't ask her father about everything personally. She sighed heavily and, looking away from her brother, said that if she went home, she would not be able to return to the palace. Luhan sighed heavily and said that he heard his father telling his mother that at the moment there was no one who could take the throne. She looked at her brother closely and asked when he had heard something like that. He said he had heard it about a few years ago. She asked if he had heard anything else. Luhan looked away from his sister and said that he had not heard anything else regarding the imperial family. She looked at her brother with a smile and said that she understood everything, and also thanked him for sharing this information with her. She smiled and thanked him for his admission and said that she was sure his mom and dad would be very proud of him, especially since he represented the recruits. She said that he should definitely tell them about it in a letter. The young man looked embarrassed and said that it was nothing special. The young lady was a little puzzled by this information. She knew that her father did not support anyone, and for this reason, he looked even more suspicious. She played her brother's words over in her head, and it seemed to her that he looked very suspicious and was not telling her everything. Lariat understood perfectly well that there was some information that was unknown to her. A moment later, she saw her friend, who was shining with beauty. Lariat looked at her friend with a joyful smile and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Richie looked intently at her friend but didn't answer. Lariat looked at her with bewilderment, as she saw that her friend was worried about something. Richie sighed heavily and asked the young lady if she had taken a day off. Lariat Vlasti said that she had, because her brother had entered the military academy, and so she had decided to take a day off to greet him. In turn, Richie, without listening to her friend, said that she knew about it. Lariat looked at her friend with bewilderment, because she saw that she was cold towards her. Richie said that she saw her, because she also came to the opening ceremony. Lariat was surprised and did not understand why her friend came to the opening ceremony. Richie sighed heavily and said that she did it because no one else was going to come to the young man. Lariat looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Lariat was a little surprised by her friend's words. Richie looked at her in surprise and asked what the problem was. Lariat smiled and said that she hadn't been able to go for a walk for a long time, and her brother's admission to the academy had become a wonderful excuse. Lariat looked at her friend tenderly and said that she really wanted to see her. Richie stared at the young lady but didn't respond, and they sat in pitch silence for several minutes. Lariat was confused and didn't understand what had happened. Richie, with lightning speed, sat up and said she wasn't in the mood to talk to her today. Richie, leaving, asked for forgiveness because she was a little tired. Lariat sighed heavily and looked closely at her friend, since she was familiar with this kind of attitude. She was taken aback, because even before her death, many years ago, there had been a time when she had suddenly begun to treat her with hostility. Now she understood perfectly well that the young lady was returning to that state. Lariat was 15 years old when her friend suddenly began to treat her coldly, but soon she became her closest and kindest friend again, so she did not ask her about the reasons for such behavior. Lariat, in turn, was a little worried, since the young lady never visited her at the palace. She was too focused on getting used to the new workplace and did not replace such an attitude. But now, looking at her friend, she understood that she had not intended to do this. Lariat asked her friend with sadness in her voice if something was wrong. Richie, in turn, sighed heavily and coldly replied that everything was fine. Lariat, your friends, and asked if it was all because she cared about the princess. She asked her friend if she didn't like the princess. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that the origins of the empress were known only to the imperial family, and since her friend was very close to the princess, she assumed that her friend had already guessed about such a secret. She knew that dirty rumors about the empress had already reached her. Richie looked at her friend sharply and said coldly that she didn't care who she served. Lariat looked at her friend with bewilderment and asked why she was acting as if she was angry. Richie coldly replied that she was not angry at all. Looking away from her friend, she said that she was only slightly confused. Lariat was surprised, because she did not expect to hear anything like that. A moment later, the young lady began talking about her friend's brother, but after a few words, she stopped herself and told her friend that she had nothing to do with it. Lariat was surprised. She asked her friend to stop, but it was all in vain. Lariat grabbed her friend's hand with lightning speed and wanted to continue their conversation, but Richie pulled her hand away. Lariat froze in shock and stared intently after her friend. Winter came unexpectedly. The young lady often went to her friend, but she still behaved coldly. Sometime later, the young lady turned 14 and the prince turned 15. Also in this year, he was elected crown prince. They slowly got used to each other, unfortunately. He ignored her, but still communicated and treated her with more warmth. Something happened sometime after that incident. He liked the dumplings she bought in the city, on the way back from her brother's entrance ceremony. Every time she wanted to meet him, she bought dumplings, so this time too, she heated up the dumplings she bought in the morning. But now she was puzzled, and I was shaking with fear, because I did not understand how everything had turned out this way. She froze for a moment in shock and hoped that the prince would say something. He looked at her intently and said that she should raise her head. She was frightened and did not know what to do. He looked at her with cold fury and asked if she had not heard, because he said that she should raise her head. The young lady, trembling with fear, immediately raised her head. She froze for a moment when she saw him in all his glory. She was in shock. She didn't know what to do. He was furious and said that he had told her to raise her head several times. Lariat was shocked and confused because it was not her fault that he had let herself be caught. Some time ago, she happily rushed to the princess as she wanted to treat her with fresh dumplings. When she knocked on the door, no one answered, but she did not suspect anything unusual, as everything was as usual. But a moment later, she froze in shock when she entered the room and saw the half-naked prince. Lariat was shocked and could not look at the prince, because she knew that she had done nothing wrong. Now she realized that he had relaxed too much. She wondered how he had not been caught in his trick before. A moment later, she screamed as she noticed that he had picked up the gun, and she begged him in a trembling voice to calm down. Lariat looked at the prince and asked him to discuss everything quietly and calmly. He looked closely at the gun and said that one conversation would be enough for me. She was scared and screamed that there was no need to kill over such a trifle. Lariat was trembling with fear and screamed that she was not worth such an effort. He grinned and aimed at his lady-in-waiting and said that everyone standing there was already dead. She froze in place for a moment in shock as she realized that he was about to kill her. Lariat was very scared because she knew that the guillotine was terrible, but being killed like a wild animal was even worse. She understood perfectly well that she needed to quickly find a way to survive. She knew that she needed to stall for as long as possible, and who could just come in and save her. But she was puzzled, because she didn't know who could help her. She didn't know who was capable of stopping the tyrant prince. A moment later, she remembered the young maid of honor. She knew that her friend would immediately help her. A moment later, the young lady screamed and asked the prince why he needed to do this. She knew she had to stall for time until the young maid of honor came to the prince's room. Lariat screamed in confusion and asked the prince why he didn't close the door. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she was the one who came in when he called Tori. The young lady shouted that she came to him because the butler said that he wanted to see her. The prince looked at the young lady intently and coldly and said that the butler was new here and did not know Tori yet. The prince informed the butler that Tori was the child who always hung around him. The prince was puzzled that the butler had called the young lady in particular. The young lady was puzzled. She said that her father would not let it go. The prince, aiming at her, said that he would insist that it was just an accident, trembling with fear. She asked if there was any meaning to this. He said that 6 months had already passed. She was taken aback and trembling with fear, asked why he wanted to convince her so much. Lariat excitedly shouted that she was on his side and would not tell anyone about his secret. The prince looked at the young lady with irritation and said that he had had enough. He did not realize how many times he had to tell her that he did not believe her. Lariat was frightened and quietly crawled towards the door. In a panic, she screamed that he shouldn't kill her because he hadn't eaten all day and she had made him dumplings. Lariat screamed at the prince that it was his fault and that she hadn't done anything on purpose. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said that she already knew. She looked at the princess with bewilderment and fear and asked what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she had known who he really was for a long time. He said that she was not surprised when she found out that he was actually a man. The young lady, taken aback and trembling with fear, said that she was very much surprised by this fact. She sighed heavily and said that she had not shown it. She glanced sideways at the prince and wondered if he was not going to shoot. She knew they had been together for a long time and had been through a lot. She wondered if it wasn't enough. She was furious and wondered what he, the monster, was going to do to her. A moment later, the prince sighed heavily and said that he would ask her again. He came closer to her and asked if she knew that he was a man. Trembling with fear, the young lady said that she had her suspicions. With the speed of lightning, the prince approached the young lady and asked where she learned such information. She said with fear that she had a very good sense. The prince looked at her with cold fury and said that she was lying to him. He looked at her intently and said that he was not even sure that he could win the throne. He looked at the young lady with a grin and said that he thought she was sure of something else. The prince looked at her intently and with a fierce grin said that otherwise she had no reason to stay near him. The young lady, in turn, looked at the prince with fear and slowly moved away from him, backing towards the door. But the prince grabbed her by the clothes and pulled her closer to him. They froze in place for a moment and looked intently at each other. The prince looked at her closely and said that she could be useful, but still he just could not believe her words, trembling with fear. The young lady said that, although he thought so, she was really on his side. Lariat looked at the prince and, trembling with fear, said that she was the most beloved daughter of her family, and when she died, her father would be furious. The prince sighed heavily and said that she was behaving as he expected. A moment later, the prince rose up with the speed of lightning. He looked at her intently and said that he thought it would be easier if he killed her. She froze in shock and wondered if she was going to die at that age. She was puzzled and wondered if all her efforts had been in vain. The young lady, in turn, did not want to die at all, remembering her family. She didn't want it all to happen again. Frozen in place, she wondered if she should kill the prince first. She supposed she would say later that she was defending herself because he wanted to kill her. But a moment later, she was taken aback and froze in shock on the spot as she heard a noise. Lariat looked in surprise at her friend, who was screaming with rage and asking the prince not to kill Lariat. The prince froze in shock. He looked at his lady-in-waiting and told her to move away immediately. Tori screamed that she would not do that. Bursting into tears, the young lady begged the prince to calm down, because Lariat was her friend. Tori screamed that she had only one friend, and she would not give her up. The prince looked at his lady-in-waiting with intent and surprise and told her to get out of the way, but Tori stood her ground and did not want to leave. A moment later, the young ladies hugged each other in tears. Tori shouted to her friend that if they both died, she would like to be the first. The prince looked at the ladies with a smirk. Lariat was well aware that today Tori was her best friend. She understood that the prince who killed the wonderful girl on the very first day of their marriage was a real monster. The young lady froze in place for a moment in surprise when she saw the raccoon stalking towards them. Lariat knew perfectly well that it didn't matter, and she would just continue to cry. A moment later, the prince turned around and put his gun back in place and cursed. Lariat looked at the prince in surprise and wondered if he would kill her. She understood that she could not yet say with certainty that this was indeed the case. She understood perfectly well that he took very good care of his lady-in-waiting, even though he killed her with his own hands. Rupert looked at the young lady intently and said coldly that he would not kill her, so she should stop crying. The young lady, bursting into tears, asked if this was true. He sighed heavily and said that she was so stupid that there was simply no need for it. She looked at the prince closely and sighed heavily, as she knew that it was very good, but unfortunately, she could not stop her tears. A moment later, she was taken aback and froze in place in shock, as a book flew past her face. The prince looked at the girls with fury and asked whether this would stop or not. The young lady was shocked. She was trembling with fear, but a moment later, Tori blocked the prince's path. Rupert was furious at such disobedience. Tori plucked up her courage and shouted for the prince. Rupert was very annoyed and asked what she wanted. The young lady sighed heavily and, bursting into tears, asked the prince not to be so angry. He looked at his maid of honor in surprise and asked if he had ever scolded her. Tori sighed and said that she was talking about her friend now. The prince was puzzled, because he understood that the young lady was making a lot of noise. Tori told the prince that it was he who made the young lady cry. A moment later, the young lady slowly approached them and handed the prince a book. She smiled tenderly and said in a trembling voice that, at this rate, he would lose all his books. The prince, with the speed of lightning, pulled the young lady's braid, thus bringing them very close to each other. He looked intently into her eyes and said that she should smile. The young lady looked at the prince with fear, but still managed to force a smile. With the speed of lightning, the prince hugged the young lady and with a grin told his maid of honor that she was smiling now, and now she was in the best mood. Lariat was puzzled and she felt very bad. She did not understand why he mocked her like that. She knew perfectly well that she had never been treated like an animal before, except before her death. She was scared and did not understand what she had done wrong. Lariat gave in to questioning. What could have happened even after a whole year? She knew that if you are talking about such a state, he will ascend the throne, then the county will not live. A moment later, she burst into tears again. Tori looked at her friend with concern and asked why she was crying again. Lariat couldn't bear it and burst into bitter tears. The prince looked at her with bewilderment and asked if she was in pain. Tori looked at the prince with worry and told him to stop squeezing the young lady's neck. The prince was puzzled and shouted that he had done nothing of the sort. Tori looked closely and attentively at the prince and said in a commanding voice that he should not bother the young lady. Rupert looked at his maid of honor in surprise and said that she had already told him not to kill her friend, not to bother her. He asked the maid of honor if she was asking for too much. The prince looked closely at the young lady who was quietly crying next to him and said that he had previously told her that he would spare her later. She said that he could scold her or hit her. The young lady froze for a moment because she was not afraid of this at all. In fact, she was afraid of what he could do in the future, being a monster. The prince looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked why he needed to burn her to kill her. She looked at him intently but didn't answer, but she still knew he would, because he was a monster who enjoyed the suffering of others. He said he wasn't going to hit her, so she should stop crying. Tori walked up to the young lady with lightning speed and told her not to cry. Tori looked at Rupert with a long, sad look and said that she needed to calm down, or she would feel unwell. Lariat knew that her friend was the best in the world. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said that she had previously told him that she would be by his side, so he wanted to know how long she would be by his side. Rupert told Lariat that if she changed her mind, she should say so, and that would make things easier for everyone. Lariat knew perfectly well that he was speaking the right words, But still they needed each other. But she knew that she should not trust everything and should keep her mouth shut. "Stop all your questions." She said that as long as he is in power, she will be by his side. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she hadn't seen the crown prince hit him. He knew that he had very little power and it wouldn't be surprising even if he died suddenly. He said that he was still alive only because the empress didn't think it necessary to kill him. The young lady looked at the prince with tears in her eyes and said that this was a very big mistake of the empress. She said that she believed that he would become a good emperor. The prince froze in shock for a moment and looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to hear anything like this. Lariat looked fearfully into the eyes of the gay prince. It seemed that he was like a goblin, because of the old forest that no one had ever looked for. The goblin was a frequent occurrence. She got goosebumps when she looked into his green eyes. Rupert looked at the young woman with a grin and said that if he said her words to Her Highness now, she would be in great trouble. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she could not say such a thing directly. He sighed heavily and said that he could assume that her family was right, so he asked what she wanted. The young lady said that she was asking him very much to protect her family. Rupert looked at her in bewilderment and asked what they needed to be protected from. She knew he had to protect her family from himself, but she told him with a smile that she wanted him to protect them from everything. It looked at her and asked if she really wanted him to protect Valois when he gained power. Lariat looked intently at the prince, without taking her gaze off him, and said that everything was correct. He looked at her in surprise and asked what he would get out of this. The young lady shyly shouted that she would give herself to him. She said that she was part of the count's family and would live as the prince wished. She looked at him intently and said that he could use her name for political purposes and she would be completely his. The prince froze in shock on the spot. He asked if he could sell her to a perverted old man in the future. The young lady sighed heavily, but still nodded in agreement. He looked at him with cold fury and indignation and said that she was just crazy. She said that everything was fine and he didn't need to worry. Rupert was surprised and did not understand why he should suddenly believe her. Lariat sighed heavily and said that she would not abandon him at all, but start trusting her right now. She understood that if she said too much, then perhaps everything would end with distrust from all sides of him. She revealed her true identity, but she could not repeat herself again. She knew perfectly well that he had not yet killed his lady-in-waiting, even though he cared for her with trepidation. She wondered if she should trust the prince. She was well aware that she needed to become the one he needed. She looked closely at the prince and said that, even if he never believed her, it did not stop him from possessing her. She knew that such an attitude was often found in this world. He looked at her intently and said that he did not need anything else. She knew that he was lying, not taking her gaze off the prince. The young lady said that she would be useful to him. He looked at her coldly and said that he already had everything he needed. She sighed heavily and said that everything would be fine even if he didn't treat her well. He said with a smirk that he would take care of what was his. Robert looked at the young lady with a grin and said that he could take care of her. He looked at her intently and said with a smirk that she must prove herself worth his efforts. The young lady froze for a moment at his words, as she knew that the goblin's hunt had begun. The young man looked at his sister excitedly and called her. She was taken aback and woke up, but a moment later her face changed, and she looked at him with a smile. He asked excitedly if something was wrong. She smiled and stroked his head with her tenderness, and said that everything was fine. He sighed heavily and said that he heard that the princess was very demanding, and assumed that his sister was having a very hard time working for the princess. He said that if it was difficult for her, then she should return home, because everyone would be very happy to see her. She sighed heavily and said that it was not about work at all, and also said that she would never return. He was surprised and did not understand why everything was like this, and he also still did not understand why she decided to come to the palace. She shuddered, not knowing what to answer. The young lady was lost in her thoughts, as she did not know how she could prove her worth to the prince. She understood perfectly well that value was a relative concept. After all she could give was her flesh and blood. She understood that her father would be adamant, like a stone wall, firmly standing his ground, and death was proof of that. Even though he lived without the slightest trust in the emperor and empress, he still maintained neutrality and the secret of the empress's low origins. She understood that her father was simply stupid, and this weighed heavily on her. Luhan looked at his sister with concern and asked if she was sure she was okay. Lariat sighed and looked closely at her brother, as she saw that he had matured, but unfortunately, she still could not trust him. She looked at her brother with a joyful smile and reached out to him. He hesitated for a few seconds, but a moment later he hugged his sister tightly, sighed and asked, what if she said that something could happen to their father? She wanted to know if he could convince him to change his mind. He sighed heavily and said that he couldn't do that. She smiled as expected for her. She looked at her brother with surprise and alarm and asked if he couldn't do it even if they all died because of it. He looked at her with alarm and asked if she had made some big mistake in the presence of the princess. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that she had never made a mistake anywhere. She looked at her brother intently and asked if he would run away if she made a mistake somewhere. She looked closely at her brother, so she knew that he was still very young, but yet he looked like a soldier. She knew that when he was a child, the atmosphere was completely different. Luhan looked at his sister intently and categorically refused. He said that if his sister sinned, he would accept punishment along with her, and her father would not be able to escape either. She sighed heavily and looked closely at her brother, as she knew that he took after his father and that they had identical ideas. She looked at her brother intently and asked if their family was destroyed because of him. Would he run away? She moved closer to her brother and asked if he would take responsibility for what he had done. Luhan, in turn, was very similar to his father. She knew that he would never shift the burden of responsibility onto someone weak and fragile. Even during his youthful maximalism, he was disciplined, and when he fought with classmates or skipped classes, he did not try to lie or avoid the consequences for his actions. The answer of the young man, born under the name of Valois, corresponded to the words of his father, who gave him this name. She knew that if the prince's wrath turned on him, he would accept it meekly. She was furious because she knew that it was such an irresponsible act that he could commit by turning a blind eye to his father's life, since it was not necessary for survival. She asked if he would take responsibility for what he had done. The young lady hoped that he would refuse. She understood that nothing terrible would happen if he ran away in order to survive. The young man froze in surprise, not knowing what to answer. She sighed heavily, as it was enough for her to see her relatives die once. For the lower class, there were no separate rooms allocated, and the entrance to the dormitory was forbidden to outsiders, but she still managed to get through. She knew that paperwork was much more suitable for her brother than swordsmanship. Lariat was glad that her brother had grown up to be a gifted child, but she didn't like the way he was willing to risk himself for his sister. She sighed heavily, because she thought about everything that had happened. Because this time, she wanted to do everything right, since she had a chance to live her life again. But the young lady was puzzled, because she knew that the emperor was still the same as in his previous life, although he looked different. A moment later, the young man sighed heavily and said that he thought he would do just that. She asked what if in that case his whole family, his children, and himself would die. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was asking an even more difficult question. The young lady looked at her brother with a smile and, asking for forgiveness, said that it was just for fun. Lariat sighed heavily, as she had already become accustomed to imagining her brother's expression. Since he and his father were taken away, she spent a lot of time in her brother's room. She wanted to remember him and never forget him. But even though she thought about them constantly, her memories gradually faded. Bursting into tears, she asked what she should do. She was scared and completely alone. The pain of loss hit her so hard that she couldn't remember their faces. Now she understood that her struggle back then had been pointless. A moment later, she flinched and looked intently at her brother. He looked at her intently and asked if this would concern her too. Lariat looked at her brother and said that it was so. Without thinking, he said that in that case he would have run away. She smiled a tender smile at her brother and said that he was much better than their father. In turn, she was irritated and wondered what responsibility was. She was angry because she knew that you had done everything possible in your past life. She understood perfectly well that it was not her fault that she did not possess any abilities or special skills. A woman, first of all, does not like to have power. She can be strong only by supporting the strong, but her father did not need this. Unfortunately, the young lady was a very proud person, but she did not regret anything. At that time, she simply had no idea about the relationship between the imperial family and her family. Unfortunately, she knew nothing and was blind in some matters. She understood that everything happened because she trusted her father too much, because she understood that back then she could not rely on anyone. She did not know what her father wanted. They had always maintained neutrality since ancient times and protected the very existence of the royal family. It did not matter who ascended the throne, as long as the purity of the imperial blood was preserved. Rupert was the child of the emperor and empress, so it was quite natural that he became the ruler. The Valois, for whom the covenant of purity of blood was so important, should not bother him. She was puzzled and did not understand why the emperor had destroyed them all then. She understood that Rupert could very well have wanted to use her relatives through her, but she had no power. Luhan looked at his sister with concern and asked her to tell him if there was anything bothering her. She sighed heavily and said that talking about the problem would not solve it anyway. He sighed heavily and asked if he was too young to help. The young lady, in turn, said that she was also too young. Looking at her brother, she said in all seriousness that that was not the issue at all. She smiled and said that they could try to ingratiate themselves with their father. He smiled and agreed with her. She said with a smile that maybe then he would do her a favor. She smiled and said that he should repeat it to her. Luhan left his sister with lightning speed. She screamed and called him, but he said that he didn't like it at all. She smiled and said that if they addressed their father so beautifully, he would like it. He sighed heavily and said that his father would like her, because she did something similar. He said that his father would simply kill him if he said something like that to him. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she knew that her father had never hit them. A moment later, she asked him if he was hungry. He looked at his sister in surprise and said that they had eaten a whole steak for lunch. She sighed heavily and said that she was already very hungry. Luhan said that they could go into town because he knew a great wheat noodle restaurant that was open late, and it was located right across from the academy. The young lady briefly imagined the delicious food because it sounded so delicious and juicy. For a moment she froze and wondered what would happen if she gained weight. But she still knew that the weight would go away on its own, and she didn't need to worry. She smiled and asked her brother whether he was hungry or not. Luhan looked at his sister with a smile as she acted very childishly. A moment later, he said that he was very hungry. She ran towards him with a smile and said that they should go and eat because she could not leave her little brother hungry, and so she would eat with her precious brother. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her. A moment later, as they walked leisurely towards a small restaurant, Luhan looked at his sister with a smile and said that they still had a little bit left. A moment later, they arrived at the restaurant. The young lady was surprised and stunned by the appearance of the restaurant itself. Luhan looked at his sister with puzzlement and asked if she didn't like this place either. She looked closely at her brother and said that this was not so, and that she, on the contrary, was happy with everything. Lariat, in turn, said that she was simply surprised that he found such establishments. He said that they visit him so often, but the restaurant was good in the winter too. A moment later, they entered a small restaurant. The young lady slowly looked around the restaurant from the inside. Luhan pulled out a chair and asked his sister to sit down. She sat down at the table with a smile and said that she had never been to a place like this before and that everything surprised her. A moment later, a young man approached them with a smile and looked at the cadet, since they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The young man said decisively that they would like to taste the seafood and meat warm. The young man looked at the cadet with a smile and asked if he would die if he just said hello, while he called the cadet by name. Luhan irritably told the young man that he never gave permission to call him by name. The young man said with a grin that it was so, and that it was very ridiculous. The young man looked at the young lady intently and asked the cadet if he had changed his girlfriend. Luhan looked at the young man intently and said that he was talking nonsense. The young man smiled and told the cadet that the last time he came here to them, he came with a girl with fluffy blue hair who seemed out of place in their restaurant. Lariat thought for a moment, because she understood who they were talking about. She looked at her brother in surprise and called him. She smiled and asked her brother if he had seen Richie. He looked at his sister in bewilderment and asked if she hadn't told her Beta. Lariat smiled and said that, unfortunately, they hadn't talked for a long time. He was surprised, as he didn't know that the work of a maid was so busy. She smiled and asked her brother if they met often. He said that the young lady was very interested in the Water Academy, and he thought that she often came to him for research. Lariat was surprised that her friend visited her brother often. After all, earlier she thought that only she saw him, but now she realized that this was not so. She was surprised and did not understand why her friend hid the fact that they were very close. She wondered if something had happened that concerned her brother. The young lady was worried because she knew nothing about her brother's affairs. A moment later, the young man brought their order. He lived easily, looked at the young lady and said that he put more meat because she was nice. Her presence shyly thanked him. He smiled and said that Luhan Tot was a womanizer, and he was a real man. Luhan did not listen to such things, and with the speed of lightning pulled the young man away from his sister. Luhan looked at the young man with cold fury and anger, and asked if he really had to hit him to make him leave. The young lady looked at the young man and asked her brother what his name was, because he was very nice. Luhan looked at his sister in surprise and asked if she really thought the young man was nice. She smiled and said that it was exactly like that, and he seemed simple to her. Luhan sighed heavily and said that the young man was expelled because he did not attend the military academy for a whole semester. He asked his sister not to pay attention to the young man. She was surprised and told her brother that he could not say such things about his friend. He said that they were not close. A moment later, the young man handed his plate to his sister. She smiled and said she was going to do it herself. He smiled and said he knew that. She looked closely at her brother and asked what he had talked about with her friend when he saw her. He sighed heavily and said that they had not discussed anything special, and they had never talked about anything specific. She looked at her brother in surprise and asked if they had talked about her. She turned her nose up and said that he had just asked her to say hello. Lariat was alarmed and said that this was not it. She asked her brother if the young lady knew his secrets that she did not know. The young man looked at his sister in bewilderment and asked what she meant. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew she needed to meet her friend, as she felt like something was wrong. He looked at her closely and asked if he could get a fork for her. A moment later, the young lady was screaming that it was very difficult for her to eat because she was not used to eating with chopsticks. But still, with lightning speed, she devoured the delicious dish. She looked at her brother in surprise and asked why he was laughing. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that she ate very diligently. She asked why he didn't follow her example then. Smiling, he began to feed her and also said that he was very glad that she liked the food. She sighed heavily, but continued eating. The young lady was puzzled, because in fact, this hurt her pride as a sister. A moment later, she had eaten her entire dinner and said with a smile that it was time for them to go. Lariat and Luhan were walking back and arguing among themselves about who should pay for dinner. Lariat smiled and said that this time she would let him pay since it wasn't an expensive dinner. He smiled and thanked her. Lariat turned around and froze in place as she saw the color of the young lady's hair, which was very bright. Lariat froze in surprise as she realized who she had just seen. She was shocked because she didn't understand what the prince was doing in such a place. With the speed of lightning, the young lady rushed towards the prince. Luhan looked after his sister with surprise and alarm as he did not understand where she ran. She looked closely after the prince because she understood that it was definitely him. But he looked a little different now, but she easily recognized him. She kept a constant watch on the prince all this time. Every step he took determined her future, but a moment later, she froze in place, rooted to the spot, because she did not know what to do. She understood that even though she knew he visited such places, she became a maid, but still did nothing for him. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had been obsessed with the past, and even she hadn't bothered to fight it properly or even get close enough to it. She was confused and upset. She wondered what she had done. The young lady was furious because she just wanted to live, and she promised to protect her family by any means necessary. But still, she was very angry with herself because she felt helpless. Luhan, with the speed of lightning, grabbed his sister's hand and called her. He looked at her intently and asked what she saw in the distance. The young lady shuddered, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she blocked the entire view with her body and said with a smile that she hadn't seen anything like that. The young man looked into the distance and saw a handsome man. She smiled and said that she thought she knew the man who had just passed by, but unfortunately, she was mistaken. She sighed heavily as she was shaking from the tension, because no matter how hard she pushed her brother, he did not move from the spot. She sighed heavily as she understood that she did not have enough strength. Luhan turned around, took his sister by the hand, and asked who the man was. He wanted to know who the man was that she was running to like that. The young lady was puzzled, because she understood that at this rate she would lose sight of the prince. A moment later she turned around and, pushing her brother away, said that she remembered that she had some things to do and therefore she needed to hurry. Mentally she asked her brother for forgiveness, but she knew that she had to do everything possible to catch up with the prince. A moment later, she greeted the prince with a radiant smile. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked in bewilderment what she was doing there. She was very angry because she wanted to ask him such a question. The young lady told the prince with a smile that she only came to meet her younger brother. He sighed heavily and said that every day she talks about her younger brother. He noticed that she is very attached to her family. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and said that her family was precious. He looked at her in surprise, not expecting anything like that. Lariat looked at the prince intently and said that her family was precious and honored. They were precious to her because she loved them very much. The prince looked at his escort and told him to let the dog go. A moment later, the young lady landed on the ground with ease and grace. She looked at the prince intently and asked where he was going. He looked away from her with a smirk and asked why she needed to know. He wanted to know if she would go with him if he told her where he was going. Lariat looked at the prince and said that there was no place where she could not go after him. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't want anything from her, and also called her stupid. Rupert looked at Max intently and asked when Fassbender would arrive. Max said that he should arrive soon. Rupert asked Max if he had finished with his assignments and also said that he had heard about the opposition. They discussed business tirelessly for some time. The young lady, in turn, quietly listened to their dialogue. The prince looked at his subordinate with fury and told him to eliminate Fassbender immediately, because she was an influential and large family in the Empire. Rupert looked at the young lady closely and said that she must be familiar with one name. She said that her father had known Horton for a very long time. He looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if she had said earlier that she would do anything if he asked. He remembered how she had said that she would give her all to him. He said that it seemed like she would be all his. The young lady said that it was so and everything would happen in the future. He said that she should find out about the company that the man was sponsoring. Rupert said that he was planning something serious and they needed to be ready for it. She was in shock and didn't understand how she was supposed to do it. The young lady froze in shock as she saw a magic circle in front of her. She was alarmed, looked at the prince and said that alchemy was forbidden. She was very scared because she knew that the prince could be cursed. Of all the types of magic, alchemy, forbidden magic, and witchcraft are taboo, which is why they have not been used for hundreds of years. This was the beginning of the early dawn of alchemy, but it was known as a manifestation of devilish powers. Unfortunately, alchemy was criticized. Alchemists tried to go against the laws of life, and therefore treated people like animals. Unfortunately, they were not able to think independently, only for the amusement of the imperial family. They lived like their slaves. The group called the Black Hands was known in the Empire. The Lord of the Black Hands was Emperor Grimoald III. It was said that he did not rest even after death and wandered the world. The young lady was frightened as she saw the appearance of alchemy right before her eyes. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked if she really believed in the curse. She sighed heavily and said that she did not believe it. As he left, the prince said that he believed it. The prince looked at the young lady with a grin and said that he was already cursed. For this reason, he could not be careful. A moment later, he grabbed her hand and pulled her along with him. With the speed of lightning, the prince leaned the young lady against the wall. Lariat froze in shock, as she did not expect this. She was very surprised and scared. She looked at the prince intently, as he frightened her greatly with his expression. A moment later, she looked at the prince with a tender smile and asked what he was doing. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she wasn't surprised. She smiled and asked if she should really be surprised. He sighed heavily and looked closely at the young lady. He asked who knew that he was a man. She smiled and said that no one knew. The prince asked if she was really going to make excuses again, that it was her intuition. She smiled and said that this was not an excuse. She asked if he didn't believe in human intuition. A moment later, the prince leaned very close to the young lady. She froze and shuddered. With the speed of lightning, he let her go and told her not to believe in anything related to people. The young lady felt relieved when he let her go and left. With an unconscious, angelic demeanor, she asked if he didn't believe her. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said that she would trust him completely instead. Rupert turned around and told his lady-in-waiting to be quiet and follow him, and he also told her that he would throw her out if she got in his way. The young lady looked at the prince with a joyful smile, as she realized that he believed that she belonged to him. She was glad of this fact and knew that she would do everything for him. Following closely behind the prince, she looked around because she did not know where they had come to. The prince turned around and, looking at the young lady, said that they were now in the room. She knew that before it was a city wall, but now this stone wall that expands and separates the districts, now she saw it from the inside. She was surprised and did not know how the prince knew such a thing. She asked with a smile if he really knew the way well. He sighed heavily and said that, of course, he knew. She was surprised and did not understand how he knew such information. Rupert said that he built it. The young lady froze for a moment in shock. Robert looked at her intently and told her that she should hurry, as he didn't want to repeat himself several times. Sometime later, the young lady followed the prince. She was puzzled because it was difficult for her to walk.